Hi everyone and welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description.
Lord of Mystery, Paradox Pathway by author D. Nan. Chapter 501 to 530. Chapter 501, Interview. Back in reality, Snow recalled Klein's various performances in the Tarot Club and compared them to his reactions in the original novel, letting out a slight sigh of relief. Although Mr. Fool didn't show too much emotion under the power of the clown potion and the concealment of the gray fog, by comparing him to the original novel, he could clearly understand Klein's current mental state. He's much better than in the original novel. This should be the effect of the groundwork laid by my previous diaries, but then there's the blow from Chernobyl. It really still requires Benson and Melissa. After Lord K returns, I'll find a way to arrange for him to see the siblings. After all, unlike Benson, who only dabbles, Melissa is quite talented in the Savant pathway. Thinking of this, Snow pulled out open black lens bracket, a story written for someone close black lens bracket, and began to conceive a relatively reasonable story outline. He always felt that if this continued, this pen would have to be renamed Open Black Lens Bracket, a story written for Klein Close Black Lens Bracket. But there was no helping it. Those of low sequence were not worthy of being arranged, those of high sequence could not be arranged, and among those of high sequence who were easy to arrange, wasn't only Klein left. However, just as he picked up the parchment, preparing to write, the atmosphere in the room suddenly darkened, and a letter fell in front of him. Looking up slightly, Dodo was flying wildly around the ceiling at an extremely fast speed, the afterimages he left almost forming a gray halo. "You go first, I'll call you if I need anything else." Snow looked at Dodo like this, his lips curving slightly. Dodo heard him, immediately let out two soft "Dodo" calls, and then disappeared from Snow's sight. Watching the impatient messenger disappear, Snow gently shook his head, reached out, and opened the envelope, which had a foundation imprint on its seal. Tisk. After glancing at the content of the letter, Snow let out a click of his tongue, and with a gentle rub of his fingers, the letter turned into a handful of ashes. He slightly adjusted his collar, took off Heaven Manufacturing, and handed it to Maria, asking her to take the little ancestor to listen to vinyl records. He then put on a tie and said to Lily, who was sucking on a squid, "I'm going to Backland, are you coming? Meow. Will you be back tonight?" Lily perked up her ears but didn't put down the grilled squid in her hand, just tilted her head and asked, "Yes, I will. Then I won't go." Lily shook her head and continued to lower her head to suck on the squid. In the office on the second floor of Enthusiasm Bar in Backland's East Borough, Snow sat in the boss's chair, looking at the passers-by outside the window. About 2 minutes later, the door was gently knocked, and after receiving Snow's response, Gianna, who now had a bit more of a godfather aura, walked in. "Sir, you're back." Gianna bowed slightly, saluting respectfully. You said someone from Military Intelligence Section 9 was looking for me. Can you confirm their identity? They showed the royal seal, it shouldn't be fake. Also, the person who came seems to be Georgina Augustus." Gianna's tone seemed uncertain, but Snow was somewhat surprised to hear this. "Georgina, the Duchess? Yes, she looks exactly like the photos in the newspaper, but her attitude was relatively gentle, and her posture was relatively low, only saying that she hoped to meet with you." Gianna's tone carried obvious doubt, as if to express his, "I suspect this is a fake," opinion to Snow. "Interesting, did she say when?" Snow already had some ideas in mind and immediately asked. "She left an address, saying that if you are willing to meet, you can go there. She will be waiting there for the next few days. If you are not at ease, you can also choose the meeting place yourself, and having someone deliver it here is also fine." Gianna repeated the words of the Military Intelligence Section 9 senior official, who was suspected to be Georgina. Snow nodded gently, took the address he handed him, glanced at it, and said, "Backland will probably not be peaceful recently. You need to restrain your subordinates, and also, pay attention to those Fosak people. As for the rest, we'll talk when I get back." "Understood." Gianna immediately nodded in agreement, but when he looked up again, he found that Snow had already disappeared without a trace. Snow, who had left the East Borough, now appeared on Williams Street in the West Borough, looking at a classy but not overly luxurious coffee shop, and walked in without a care. "Hello, sir, is there anything I can help you with?" With the waiter's greeting, Snow showed a friendly smile, looking at this arbiter miss, who was probably in her early 20s. After her cheeks flushed slightly, he spoke. "Calendula private room." Hearing the name of the private room, a hint of surprise immediately flashed in the girl's eyes, and then she immediately narrowed her eyes, maintaining her smile as she said, "Okay, please follow me." This coffee shop had 2 rows of private rooms. After passing through a corridor wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, Snow saw the woman who could obtain a ducal title in the royal family, which believed in the Lord of Storms. She was wearing a black long dress, her brown-black hair was coiled at the back of her head, and her eyes exuded a sharp feeling. Against the backdrop of these eyes, her otherwise relatively soft face also became full of heroic spirit. Seeing Snow enter, the Duchess showed a slightly stiff smile, elegantly rising from her seat, which made Snow feel somewhat amused. An imperative mage, a sequence 4 Duchess, a member of the royal family who had lived since childhood under the belief of the Lord of Storms, where patriarchal ideas were prevalent, how could she not even manage a formulaic smile? Undoubtedly, the moment that smile appeared, the other party had already begun to employ deception. Or rather, the other party's choice to send a duchess over itself carried a very obvious purpose. Is this trying to make me practice spirit stacking? Snow rolled his eyes inwardly, but a business-like smile appeared on his face as he spoke. "Hello, Ms. Georgina, your beauty makes the stars dim in comparison." "Hello, Mr. Snow, I am very pleased by your arrival." Princess Georgina did not extend her right hand. Instead, she subtly lifted her skirt and performed a curtsy, then made an invitation to sit. Such a low posture. Snow became even more surprised. Could this duchess be here for a blind date? Dismissing this somewhat amusing thought, Snow got straight to the point, saying, "Duchess Georgina, to be honest, I don't think I'm worth Military Intelligence Section 9 putting on such a show. If even a saint is not worthy of such courtesy, that would be too much pride." Georgina Augustus's tone was slightly stiff, but her voice was very melodious. Snow merely smiled upon hearing this. Seeing that Snow had no response, Georgina simply picked up the teapot on the table, poured Snow a steaming cup of black tea, and then continued. "Mr. Snow, are you interested in reclaiming your title?" Chapter 502 Conditions. Hearing Duchess Georgina's words, Snow's eyes narrowed slightly, forming a somewhat dangerous expression on his handsome face. He leaned forward slightly, toying with the teacup in his hand, and said in a calm but emotionless tone, "Duchess Georgina, you can just speak directly." Seeing Snow's attitude, Georgina was not surprised. Apart from a few pathways that could accelerate acting and digestion through nobility, a noble title was not something worth a demigod's attention. The reason she used the title as an opening was because, according to Military Intelligence Section 9's information, this gentleman's father had dedicated his entire life to restoring his family's noble title. That's why she wondered if she could gain his support at the lowest possible cost. Of course, this was just a simple probe. Success would be a gain, and failure would be no loss. The Duchess adjusted her posture, making herself appear more delicate. Then, she lowered her gaze, trying her best not to look directly at Snow with her sharp eyes to avoid triggering a stress response. Afterward, she adjusted her tone and said, "Mr. Snow, the Intis workers' movement has caused quite a stir among the nations of the continent." So, Snow put down his teacup, casually waved his hand, and retrieved a teapot, whose style was different from common black tea sets, from a glowing door beside him. He poured himself a drink and watched Georgina's performance with interest. However, to his surprise, the Duchess did not show any anger at Snow's dismissive behavior. She maintained her humble posture and said, "When war approaches, no one will tolerate instability in the rear. The Intis workers' movement has already shown its fangs. Therefore, I believe we should discuss the future position of this organization." "Is that why?" Snow raised his eyebrows noncommittally, his tone becoming lighter. "The core pursuit of the workers' movement is to obtain reasonable income and working hours. As long as these 2 points are met, no one is willing to risk their lives. The success of the Intis workers' movement is mainly due to Intis's national conditions. The capitalist-first environment of Intis, which oppresses workers, is well known. Coupled with forced conscription during the war and soaring food prices in the rear, This led to a situation where doing nothing meant death, and revolution also meant death. Since both lead to death, why not choose the one with greater profit? No, Mr. Snow, you misunderstood. Georgina shook her head slightly, her sharp eyes meeting Snow's for the first time. A confident smile appeared on her face, and she said with surging emotion, Loan is not like Intis. The Augustus family is enough to suppress all risks. Even if we go to war with Fosak, the Evernight goddess and the god of storms are our firm allies. With the eternal blazing sun church heavily damaged and the church of the god of knowledge and wisdom busy receiving war dividends, even if the workers' movement can win over the machinery church, it will not pose a threat. So, Snow's eyebrows rose, finally realizing the other party's intention. Georgina saw this but did not prolong the suspense, directly stating, I heard that the leader of the workers' movement, Mr. Lavish, is currently in Fosak. You mean, support all actions of the workers' movement in Fosak? Snow's smile immediately became genuine. Georgina's sharp eyes also softened slightly. She nodded gently, confirming, that's right, Military Intelligence Section 9 is willing to support all actions of the workers' movement in Fosak, including but not limited to funds, personnel, and intelligence. But in return, the workers' movement must also ensure that after the war begins, the workers' movement will fully sabotage Fosak. No, Ms. Georgina, your wording is incorrect. Snow waved his hand, interrupting Georgina's words, and his address changed from Duchess to Ems. The workers' movement will not destroy any country, they merely make workers the masters of the country, nothing more. Of course, in foreign wars, internal reforms are often easier. I don't believe you. Such a thought flashed through Georgina's mind, but she nodded on the surface and said, that's good. Can we sign a contract? This is a guarantee for both of us. You can consider it the foundation of trust. Of course, no problem. Snow smiled and nodded, pulling out his portable quill from his pocket, intending to draft the contract. Seeing Snow's familiar demeanor, Georgina for a moment actually doubted whether she was an arbiter or if the other party was. However, Georgina did not interrupt Snow's writing process. Instead, while reviewing the terms he wrote, looking for possible loopholes, she continued, His Majesty the King is very interested in Enthusiasm's mode of operation. Oh, that's a bit unexpected. Snow's tone was flat, showing no hint of surprise. Georgina ignored his tone and continued, Are you interested in transforming Enthusiasm from a backland gang into the darkness order of the entire Loan? Interesting. Snow looked up, his gaze meeting Georgina's again, then fell back to the parchment, and he said playfully, Even if Enthusiasm believes in a great existence that does not belong to the 7 orthodox deities. The royal family doesn't care about such things. Georgina showed an indifferent attitude and said playfully, As long as you don't establish formal churches and don't openly proselytize, there's no problem. After all, the royal family supports many demigods, and there are also a few angels. Developing believers is a reasonable thing, isn't it? Then, what do I need to pay? Snow's pen stopped, his tone becoming slightly more serious. Georgina's lips curved upwards slightly, as if she finally felt a sense of swapped positions. However, she did not get carried away, still maintaining a slightly humble posture, and said gently, His Majesty the King needs a stable environment and needs only one voice throughout the country after the war begins. After the Great Fog in Backland, Enthusiasm did very well. His Majesty the King hopes that when the war begins, the entire country can have that kind of order. If those are the only conditions, I can agree. Snow pondered for a moment and then nodded. Georgina, however, shook her head and said, This is just the most basic obligation. And as the price for fulfilling these conditions, you need to accept a mission. Tell me about it. Snow picked up his quill again, writing the terms related to Enthusiasm into the contract. Georgina then said casually, When necessary, guard an important area for the royal family. This mission may involve encountering demigods, but you don't need to fight to the death, you just need to stall for time. If you encounter a death threat, you can leave directly. What place? And the specific time? Snow's hand suddenly stopped, and then he crumpled the half-written contract into a ball. Seeing this, Georgina smiled and said, After the war with Fosak begins, at the latest by early next year. As for the location, I will only tell you when the mission begins. If that's the case, the previous conditions aren't quite enough, A flame rose in Snow's hand, burning the parchment to ashes. Georgina, however, showed a slightly charming smile and said, "It's all right, there's still plenty of time. We can talk all night." "Not tonight, I need to go home and feed my cat." "Tomorrow." Quote. Chapter 503 Directionality. On Thursday, July 7, 1350, Snow, after a complex and lengthy enfeoffment ceremony, reclaimed his Viscount title and, after friendly negotiations with Earl Hall, redeemed the territory that once belonged to the Pandrax family at a suitable price. However, at the banquet routinely held on the night of his promotion, only some minor nobles with ties to military intelligence Section 9 were present. The only truly important figure was Lord Hilbert Hall, Earl Hall's eldest son and the current chief secretary of the kingdom's Air Pollution Investigation Committee. "You're less popular than I imagined," Georgina Augustus, an uninvited guest, remarked, her brow twitching slightly and a hint of mockery in her tone, as she watched the spirit maids boldly emerge to clean up after the ball. Snow rubbed Dodo's head in his arms and said nonchalantly, "After all, not everyone can accept a former plaything suddenly entering the same class as them, not to mention His Majesty the King generously bestowed a Viscount title. Oh, my, I remember a baron's title costs £800,000 now. Honestly, I'm flattered that Mr. Hilbert even attended, considering that's 4 million acres of land, £1 million was definitely a steal. Rest assured on that point, Earl Hall is a very far-sighted noble. His decision to have his eldest son join the Air Pollution Investigation Committee is an example. Compared to 4 million acres of land, the goodwill of a demigod is clearly more important. Moreover, he is already shifting his assets from land to industries like steel, railways, coal, and banking. £1 million in liquid capital is not a small sum, even for him." Georgina Augustus displayed a serene smile, but Snow merely glanced at her noncommittally, found a random seat, and said indifferently, "With such a grand display, you all must be relieved now, right?" Hearing Snow's words, a flicker of surprise crossed Georgina's eyes, but Snow continued casually. "A noble's enfeoffment is itself a ceremony of loyalty to the royal family. Under the power of the arbiter pathway, ceremony is a contract, and a contract is order. Being enfeoffed is equivalent to being bound. You wouldn't think I'm the kind of idiot who would just gobble up any benefit I see, would you? In any case, since you have accepted the enfeoffment, you are already one of us." After a brief silence, Georgina Augustus recomposed her expression and took out a document from her handbag, handing it to Snow. The golden words, shimmering with lightning, seemed to contain an irresistible power. "That's why I say you're not grand enough in your actions. Since I've already agreed to join, it would have been better for everyone if this had been made clear from the start. If you had told me and I was unwilling, it would prove I wasn't sincere, and forcing me onto the war chariot wouldn't do any good. If I agreed, there would be no ill will in future cooperation. It's better than your little schemes and calculations." Snow took the document and, while reading, spoke without reservation. Although Georgina's face showed no expression, the uncontrolled electric flashes in her eyes were enough to show how much she wanted to punch his head off at that moment. However, she couldn't hit him. Because she couldn't win. After all, this person, in a one-on-one situation, had successively slain the Archbishop of the Holy Light Church and the Avatar of the Eternal Blazing Sun's descent in what was almost a relay battle. This record, if not for the Protector's personal confirmation of the accuracy of the source, no one would have believed that a Sequence 3 saint could achieve such a brilliant feat. Not to mention, he also had a true deity behind him. Under Georgina's resentful gaze, Snow finished reading the document in his hand. The content was not extensive, apart from some ciphers for Military Intelligence Section 9 and a list of spies embedded in FOSAC. It was all information he had already known from the original work. However, as he read, the golden words on the document began to transform into tiny chains, layer by layer, wrapping around his brain, completely sealing off all information related to the Augustus family. The powers of spectator and arbiter. You've collaborated with the psychology alchemists. Snow raised an eyebrow, not at all surprised by the presence of these chains. Georgina did not answer directly, merely taking out a badge-like token and handing it to Snow. With this medal and the ciphers in the document, you can mobilize members of Military Intelligence Section 9 below Sequence 5. Of course, missions need to be reported. You can use this to cultivate enthusiasm, or you can mobilize the embedded personnel on the list. If you need to develop peripheral members, you just need them to place their hand on this badge and swear allegiance to the Augustus family. Snow took the badge, casually tucked it into his pocket, and then unceremoniously said, "Everything that needed to be said has been said. You can go back now." Upon hearing this, Georgina gave Snow a deep look, forcibly suppressed the anger in her heart, and turned to leave Snow's residence. Watching her figure disappear, Snow placed Dodo aside, took out a piece of parchment, and began to write a letter. The Augustus royal family's contract process, under the supervision of the Russian priest, could largely be considered foolproof, but they ultimately overlooked one thing. Augustus also had a prince wandering outside. Although directly breaking a contract constructed by the collaboration of two sequence ones without attracting attention was somewhat difficult, Snow was capable of merely distorting its direction. The pen tip gently glided, and letters blurred across the parchment. "Dear Lady Kingdom, it's been many days since we last met. I wonder if you have achieved your long-cherished wish of hunting the iron-blooded knight. And have you already settled the score with Triss? If not, I regret to inform you that you have a new mission. I believe you are already aware of the situation between Lowen and Fosak. I wonder if you are interested in reclaiming everything you have lost. Come back, return to Backland. You will, as an unofficial member of Military Intelligence Section 9, intervene in the great changes about to occur in the kingdom. You will have an opportunity. Do not worry about the iron-blooded knight. Fosak's Einhorn family also controls the hunter pathway. In the coming war, you will also have a chance. Of course, whether you ascend as a queen or become Lowen's next king, that will depend on your own choice. Oh, and whether or not to tell Triss about this is up to you. Your friend, Crown." With the last stroke, Snow skillfully took out an envelope, pressed the newly crafted crown ring onto the sealing wax, leaving a magical imprint with anti-prying power. "Dodo, deliver this to Lady Kingdom." Chapter 504. If you want your subordinates to work hard, besides talking about ideals, you also need to establish a competitive relationship. In the living room of Viscount Panradax's mansion in Empress Borough, Backland, two demonesses were looking at Snow, who was petting a cat, with complex expressions. "I didn't expect you two to come together. Speaking of which, Adelina, how come I didn't know you were so generous with sharing?" Snow grinned lightly as he looked at the two demonesses in front of him. As soon as he spoke, both demonesses' expressions immediately changed. "Bullshit, this guy sent people to monitor me." "You're the bullshit, I don't believe you didn't send people to monitor me." Although they were clearly demonesses, perhaps due to their recent preparations for the iron-blooded knight advancement ritual, both had somewhat eccentric personalities. However, when women fight, those who know. Even demonesses, when they fight, it's quite a sight. However, considering his mansion had just finished renovations, Snow ultimately interrupted the two demonesses' glaring match, their eyes practically spitting black fire, and chuckled softly. "Ahem, regardless of how Triss found out, since she's also here, it means neither of you succeeded. Can I assume that? The demigods of the Sauron family are cowards, running faster than rabbits, actually letting ordinary people cover their retreat." Triss muttered resentfully. Adelina, who had been glaring at Triss, immediately nodded in agreement. "Those iron-blooded knights are an insult to both the words, iron-blooded, and knight. If you can't catch them, you can only blame your trap designing skills for not being precise enough. Never mind, there's no point in saying more. How about this, I can offer you another choice." Snow casually pulled out two vials, one labeled, Demoness of Despair, and the other, Iron-Blooded Knight. He covered both vials with a cloth and said with a playful expression, "I will prepare one potion from each of these pathways, using Beyander abilities to shield mystical connections and completely isolate spiritual intuition and divination. Then, I will give you a task. Whoever completes it first will have the right to choose first. However, once chosen, it must be drunk on the spot. As for the remaining vial, it belongs to the other person. How about it, isn't it interesting? Are you a devil?" Triss looked at Snow's playful smile, her expression extremely grim. Snow, however, said indifferently, "You can also choose not to take the task and hunt iron-blooded knights yourselves. After all, there will be battles between Lowen and Fosak coming up, so there will be plenty of opportunities to encounter iron-blooded knights. Although he said that, Adelina and Triss both understood that they didn't have many options. Because once they let the other person choose first, if they accidentally drank the demoness of despair, it would be almost impossible for them to advance to iron-blooded knight. Putting themselves in the other's shoes, if they accidentally drank the demoness of despair, there was absolutely no way they would let the other party become an iron-blooded knight. And as a demigod, making it impossible for a mere sequence 5 to drink a potion was truly too easy. In the most extreme case, it wouldn't be impossible to simply prepare another demoness of despair and force it down the other person's throat. Of course, if the other party became an iron-blooded knight, they might spare them, but just like the joke Snow made earlier, they didn't dare to gamble, nor were they willing to hand over the initiative to the other party. Therefore, regardless of whether they drank that potion or not, they had to accept the task and complete it first. Only then could they ensure they had the right to choose first when the other party completed the task, instead of letting the other party become a demigod and no longer even having the right to drink the potion. Looking at the two caught in a prisoner's dilemma, Snow's smile grew even brighter. For people like Mr. A and Lavish, he didn't need any coercion, because they acted for their own dreams and ideals. As long as Snow provided a plan to reach their goal, they would pursue and complete it with all their might. But Triss and Adelina were different. Without strong enough incentives, even if these two didn't outwardly comply while secretly defying, they would still find various ways to slack off. To make them exert maximum effort, Snow not only offered a carrot but also a big stick. "Tell us, what's the task?" Adelina quickly sorted out her thoughts and immediately asked the key question. If the task required a long time, she could still try to continue hunting Sauron or Einhorn. Adelina's task is to join Military Intelligence Section 9 and expand her social circle as much as possible, primarily targeting high-ranking officials of Military Intelligence Section 9 and the Lowen military. Triss's task is to use the social season to socialize with as many nobles and parliament members as possible. The deadline is the last day of November. Whoever achieves the best results will have priority in choosing. As soon as Snow spoke, the expressions of both women immediately darkened, because this meant their subsequent actions had to revolve around Backland. If anyone left here, their task progress would inevitably drop, unless they were confident of hunting a demigod within 4 months. Otherwise, they would inevitably face the outcome of the other party reaching demigod status before them. As if noticing their hesitation, Snow's smile grew even brighter. He pulled out 2 more bottles from a corner and placed them with the previous 2 potion vials, saying, "If you still have concerns, I can also provide 4 potions, 2 Demoness of Despair and 2 Iron-Blooded Knight. This way, you might both get the Iron-Blooded Knight potion." "No need." Triss and Adelina refused almost in unison, then exchanged another intense glare. The reason they rejected this option was that Adelina and Triss both understood what kind of malicious humor the man in front of them possessed. If there were only 2 potions, they could gamble that the other person would be unluckier than themselves, but if there were 4 potions, even if the other party didn't tamper with them, according to the Beander characteristic convergence law, the most likely outcome would be that both of them would become demonesses of despair. In that case, let's get to it. I've already prepared your new identities. Before Snow could finish speaking, Triss suddenly interrupted. My task seems easier than Adelina's. Does this affect the final evaluation? If so, I hope to know the specific evaluation criteria. You're overthinking it. Didn't you see Adelina herself didn't object? Snow shook his head and said with a smile, Adelina is the 3rd prince of Lowen. She inherently has a certain advantage in this task. By the way, the essence of your tasks is a ritual. I want to use this to transfer the loyalty contracts of both the Lowen military and political factions onto Adelina. In this way, Adelina will become the queen or king of Lowen. If you work hard, it's not impossible for you to become a prince or queen consort. Who would become the queen? Who would become the queen consort? As soon as they spoke, the two immediately glared at each other again, and the competitive atmosphere instantly became heated. As for the identity of the new monarch, for the two who had already witnessed this person seize the political power of a country, wasn't it just a puppet king? What was there to be surprised about? Chapter 505, Klein has a new goal. While Snow was plotting his coup, Klein was controlling his marionette to meet with Nast, the king of the five seas. The marionette, barely 2 fingers thick, sat in its seat, facing Nast, who was over 1.9 meters tall, with a majestic and imposing demeanor, yet showed no weakness. After a brief exchange of words, Nast seemed to confirm something and stared down at Klein, saying, "My impression of Emperor Rosal is simple. No one was more suited to become the Black Emperor than he was." Without any explanation, the words seemed a bit disjointed, but Klein, who possessed the Black Emperor card, immediately understood the other party's meaning. Although the Emperor only decided to jump to the Black Emperor pathway in his later years, before that, the articles he copied, the machinery he designed, the Industrial Revolution he initiated, and the countless legends he left behind, it could be said that the name of that era was Rosal, and only the name Rosal could encapsulate that era. All of this, unknowingly, completed the accumulation for the Black Emperor ritual. Even Solomon, the famous Black Emperor in history, was far from achieving the order left by Rosal. Klein didn't know how many of these things were coincidences resulting from Rosal's plagiarism, or how many were pre-arranged layouts, but as someone who already knew about the existence of the Sunset Otaku group, Klein was always a bit sensitive to the word coincidence. At this moment, he suddenly recalled Senior Paindrax's description of the creator's son. He suspected that the continental history of the fifth epoch was a ritual prepared by that person for godhood, and Rosal's appearance disrupted his ritual. But if that were truly the case, wouldn't it mean that the author was also a transmigrator? But there were only 3 cocoons above the gray fog. Or perhaps, as Senior Paindrax speculated, there were actually many transmigrators. The reason there were only 3 broken cocoons above the gray fog was simply because that was only one of the pathways to transmigration. Many thoughts flashed through Klein's mind in an instant, but he did not forget the purpose of this visit. He suppressed the churning thoughts in his heart and continued to ask his question. In his later years, did the Emperor ask you or your father to do any secret things? The spurred crown on Nast's head swayed slightly, and he said in a low voice, "Someone once asked me the same question. Bernadette." Klein made a bold guess, and Nast gave an affirmative answer. Yes. At that time, she was still very young and immature to actually ask such a question. Given Emperor Rosal's status and level in his later years, what secret matter would he entrust to me and my father to do that would be more confidential than him plotting and acting in secret himself? Klein, hearing Nast mocking his immaturity, smiled and said, "For those who care about such matters, even a glimmer of hope is not something they are willing to let go of." This was also the reason he came to see the King of the Five Seas this time. After all, after seeing that glowing door above the gray fog, the only ways he could think of to obtain clues about that glowing door in reality were from the 2 seniors, Rosal and Paindrax. Senior Paindrax was still alive, and as long as he advanced to Sequence 3, he could directly inquire. However, compared to this senior who was only Sequence 4, Emperor Rosal, who had once touched the Sequence 0 level, probably held more clues. Not to mention that he had once created the silver card, and touched the gray fog. No one could guarantee whether he had explored that gray fog again after becoming an angel or even a god. However, Nast evidently heard other meanings in Klein's words. The dark red light in his eyes flickered, and his majestic voice sounded again. "What is your relationship with Emperor Rosal? Old friends, I suppose." Klein sighed slightly. As he had progressed, Rosal, through his act of reading the diary, had long been regarded by him as a true fellow countryman, a true friend. It was the same longing for home that brought about this sense of identity. Not just Rosal, but Senior Paindrax as well. Looking at the expression on this demigod, who was as thin as a book, Nast withdrew his gaze. He spoke in a low voice. "Any other questions?" Klein had already prepared his thoughts. As his thoughts were interrupted, he asked at a steady pace. "In your opinion, what was unusual about Emperor Rosal in his later years?" Nast, with slightly wrinkled brows, remained silent for a long time before finally speaking. "I don't know much about him, so I can't find anything unusual. The only thing I found strange was that whenever my father and I met him, he would stand in front of the floor-to-ceiling window on the west side, gazing into the distance. This happened in the morning, at noon, and in the evening, and that room didn't only have that one row of floor-to-ceiling windows." West side. Klein's pupils suddenly contracted. If he had just arrived in this world, he might have guessed that the emperor was gazing at the misty sea, at the mysterious island in the misty sea. But now, after reading Senior Paindrax's diaries, he had another guess. What Emperor Rosal was looking at was the end of the misty sea, the legendary homeland of the elves, the mysterious west continent from which the race that ate Mao Shuiwang with chopsticks emerged. Indeed, whether it's Senior Paindrax or Emperor Rosal, they both ultimately focused their attention on this west continent. Is there really something special on that continent? Are the elves really related to the Zhonghua family? Did they transmigrate as an entire race? Their architectural style is similar to ancient Zhonghua family, but they left no writing. Is it because they came from ancient Zhonghua family and had low literacy rates? As for not speaking Chinese, in the Zhonghua family, accents differ every 10 li, and ancient Chinese itself is vastly different from Mandarin. It's not surprising that after localization, no trace of Chinese can be seen. As the saying goes, suspecting a neighbor of stealing an axe. Once Klein had this idea, all the conditions seemed to provide favorable evidence for his conjecture. He even began to wonder if there might be something like an interstellar teleportation array, as found in Xuanwan novels, on that land. However, fantasy was still fantasy. Klein quickly stopped his thoughts, which had already begun to wander. He could guarantee that Nast had definitely figured out what he had guessed from the clue of West Side. However, since the other party didn't speak immediately, he also didn't say much, merely standing up at once. I've asked all my questions. Please forgive my presumptuous visit. I wonder what kind of transaction I can help with. In Backland, Snow, who had just seen off 2 demonesses, suddenly felt a sharp loss of spirituality. However, instead of being alarmed, Snow was delighted. He immediately dispatched a large number of monkeys to trace the changes in fate. Good heavens, I haven't even had time to guide him, and K. Kong has already arranged himself. Is this also a form of different paths, same destination? Chapter 506, Helping Audrey Improve Her Sales. 22 Pacesville Street, the location of the Lowen Charity Scholarship Foundation. Audrey placed the document back on the desk and looked up at the clock hanging on the wall of the director's office. It had just turned 10. She carefully surveyed her surroundings, confirming no one else was present, then discreetly straightened her legs, arched her back, and tensed her arms, performing an imperceptible stretch. But just then, a knock suddenly sounded on the office door, making Audrey jump. However, the hypnotist's power allowed her to quickly compose her momentary panic, resuming her charming and captivating Miss Audrey persona, and she called out to the door. Come in. Miss Audrey, a gentleman has decided to donate a sum of money, and he specifically asked to see you. The person who entered was a somewhat impetuous young woman. She was one of the first beneficiaries of the Lowen Charity Scholarship Foundation and, thanks to her good literary and social skills, was working part-time as a receptionist to support her studies. Understood, I'll be right there. Audrey took a small mirror from her waist pouch, tidied her flawless appearance, then stood up and said to the young woman at the door. Did he introduce himself? Although Audrey had not been a director of the Lowen Charity Scholarship Foundation for long, due to her social standing as Earl Hall's daughter and Backland's most dazzling jewel, she had already encountered many minor nobles and merchants who, under the guise of donations, hoped to establish a connection with her. However, she wasn't averse to such matters. Regardless of their intentions, the donated funds were real and genuinely helped impoverished children, giving them a chance to change their fate. That was enough. He introduced himself as Viscount Panradaxes and only brought one valet. He is currently in the VIP lounge. The young woman immediately reported the somewhat tongue-twisting surname. Coming from a humble background, she wasn't very clear on the well-known news within aristocratic circles, and naturally didn't understand the reputation of the indescribably handsome gentleman in Lowen's social scene. Upon hearing the surname, Audrey's eyes immediately lit up, and she promptly said, I'll go right away. Quote. Good morning, Miss Hall, your beauty dims the stars. Good morning, Mr. Paindrax. Audrey curtsied slightly and sat opposite Snow on the sofa where he had been. The moment they both resettled, a familiar sensation spread between them. Audrey, now a hypnotist, finally grasped a subtle detail of this power when Snow made no attempt to conceal it, a subconscious disregard that isolated their conversation from the gaze of others. It's truly not easy to see you these days. As their private space expanded, Snow's posture immediately became much more relaxed. His tone carried a hint of teasing, and Audrey, hearing this, also said with a touch of helplessness, "I originally wanted to attend the previous enfeoffment banquet, but my brother thought it might convey some inappropriate information to the outside world." Watching Audrey's cat's eye expression, Snow couldn't help but smile, shaking his head and saying, "That's natural. After all, your father sold a large tract of land at what could be called a low price. This in itself is a very noteworthy action. If you were to attend the banquet again, I believe today's hot topic in all of Backland's salons and balls would become the gossip about the Hall family attempting to marry into a newly ennobled family. That's just groundless speculation from uninformed people." Audrey's cheeks flushed slightly but quickly returned to normal. In fact, compared to such rumors, she had even heard worse. For example, Earl Hall's daughter fell in love with a famous social butterfly, and for his beloved daughter, and to avoid damaging the family's reputation, Earl Hall could only resell the land and help him secure a peerage. In reality, her father, Earl Hall, had already convened a family meeting before selling the land to analyze Mr. Snow's political value, primarily to appease her elder brother. Seemingly not intending to continue the somewhat awkward topic, Audrey proactively changed the subject. "By the way, Mr. Devil, is there something you needed to see me about this time?" "Yes, there are two main things." Snow nodded, first taking out a Backland bank check for £100,000. As a newly ennobled noble, participating in charity is essential. Compared to those so-called charity events, I trust this place more. Additionally, you should have heard of the Enthusiasm organization under my command. I will leave you a business card. If you have any matters that are inconvenient to handle through official channels, you can seek their assistance. Although Audrey had guessed that Mr. Snow would donate, she hadn't expected such a large sum at once. While some merchants obtained peerages through large political donations and charitable contributions, those charities were actually tributes to His Majesty the King through charitable channels. True charitable donations, even her father only contributed £10,000. Seemingly noticing Audrey's surprise, Snow offered a gentle smile and said, "No need to be surprised. This is also a form of debut. You should understand that some things are not decided by a mere enfeoffment ceremony. Nobility is a circle, and to enter this circle, one must display certain things, either wealth, or force, or power, or influence. Although I lack none of these aspects, influence and force are more on the Beyonder level. For those arrogant nobles in Loan, they clearly don't consider Beyonders a form of capital. And my power is more within military intelligence section 9, which is inconvenient to display much of. So, I can only demonstrate sufficient financial strength. As long as I show that I am wealthy enough, even if I am considered a nouveau riche, those who would sell everything to maintain noble dignity will eventually make concessions out of self-interest. Moreover, the party struggle in the kingdom is very intense. My current inclination is purely royalist. As long as I demonstrate sufficient value, both the old and new parties will try to win me over, especially the conservative old noble system whose main income comes from land rent. After all, 100 years ago, the Pandrax family was also a traditional noble family ennobled through war." "I see." Audrey, being from a noble family, immediately understood Mr. Devil's intentions after comparing it to her father's political standing. However, she didn't immediately process the donation but continued. "And the other matter. The other is, of course, to recharge the illusion on you. Recently, a force has been trying to deepen the rift between the old and new parties, with many high-level spectators involved. This is also why I accepted the enfeoffment at this time. In short, the psychology alchemists might have a big move soon. Every time you meet their people, it's best to pray for the fool's protection, and the illusion I've placed on you is to ensure you have a chance to complete that prayer in the instant of an unexpected encounter." Chapter 507, Klein begins to transform. 7:30 p.m., 39 Bachland Street, at Counselor Matched's home. Klein, in Kid Robin's appearance and wearing a tailcoat, stepped out of the carriage. Illuminated by the lamplit fountain, he entered the foyer accompanied by his marionette butler, Enuni. There, he saw Maury Matched, dressed in an olive-green military uniform, wearing an orange-red armband, and adorned with combat medals. After a few brief greetings, he bypassed his host and entered the hall, awaiting the start of the evening's ball. It should have been like this. But to his hair-raising surprise, an unexpected person appeared in his line of sight. Triss, the instigator who caused the tragedy of the clover. The mysterious witch who hinted at old Neil's signs of losing control. Klein's first reaction was to immediately draw his gun, but he restrained himself, not only because this was Counselor Matched's home, but also because he saw the ring on her hand. It was a ring cast in gold, the gem and intricate patterns were secondary, but the ancient Hermes words representing the number, 6, and beauty, immediately reminded Klein of its counterpart. Yes, this was a set of stand rings made by Senior Paindrax, containing a certain secret left by that senior. There were 10 in the set, and he had previously seen similar rings on Iceberg Vice Admiral Edwina, Gang Leader Gianna, and Mr. Devil. Is she Mr. Devil's subordinate? Klein frowned slightly, beginning to ponder when exactly she had joined Mr. Devil's ranks, and whether Mr. Devil knew her background. It was at this moment that a scene suddenly flashed through his mind. He instinctively turned his head and saw Mr. Devil entering the main hall, guided by Counselor Matched. Long time no see, kid, welcome back to Backland. Long time no see, Snow, I haven't congratulated you yet on regaining the Pendergast family's peerage. Klein paused briefly to show his surprise at seeing an acquaintance, then stepped forward 2 paces and greeted him familiarly. If you had returned 2 days earlier, my ennoblement banquet wouldn't have been so deserted, Snow complained dramatically, then walked with Klein to a corner. As an invisible force enveloped the two, Klein finally spoke. Mr. Devil, Triss, the lady over there, is she your subordinate? That's right. Snow nodded slightly, showing no intention of hiding anything. You should remember me mentioning at the Tarot Club that I was investigating the demonist sect, right? Klein thought for a moment and immediately recalled that it seemed to be before the Great Smog of Backland, which was around the time Duke Negan was assassinated. After the Great Smog, because of the demoness of despair, he had always thought Mr. Devil's goal was to investigate the Great Smog, but now it sounded like there was another hidden agenda. Seeing Klein's slightly puzzled expression, Snow smiled. The demonist sect and the Lowen royal family have some dealings. The Great Smog of Backland, besides providing a potion for that demoness of despair to digest, was also for a divine descent. Triss was the vessel prepared by the demonist sect for the divine descent. After I rescued her, she became my subordinate, investigating the Lowen royal family for me. Listening to Snow's account, Klein's heart felt a bit complex. Then, as if deep in thought, he asked, did you regain your peerage for this as well? That was part of the reason, Snow said vaguely, then abruptly changed the subject. Speaking of which, Amon's avatar is looking for the fool's believers in Backland. You'd best be careful. I know, but I don't plan to hide. Instead, I intend to ambush him proactively. Do you have any suggestions? Klein, hearing Amon's name, although still pondering what Mr. Devil deliberately concealed, answered truthfully. Oh, that's right, after all, Amon himself is a problem that a seer pathway demigod must face, Snow said, turning his head to glance at Hyrule, who was greeting guests at the banquet. She is about to advance to sequence 7 of the Marauder pathway, and she once had an encounter with a Marauder demigod. After I dealt with that demigod, an empty shell was left here, which can be used as bait to attract Amon. Of course, the prerequisite for this is that you must possess the ability to obscure Amon's perception. Otherwise, even if you kill his avatar, you will quickly be locked onto by Amon. Additionally, I just joined Military Intelligence Section 9 recently, and I'm afraid I'll be very busy, so I probably won't be able to offer you much help in hunting Amon. It's fine, I intended to handle it myself anyway. Klein shook his head, though he felt a slight regret, then began to consider what aspects could provide assistance. The old man in Leonard's body can definitely be brought over, our interests are aligned in confronting Amon. Besides that, I can ask and the goddess, after all, this is the goddess's diocese, and Counselor Matched's family are also believers of the goddess. Klein quickly made his calculations in his mind before speaking. What should I do? You can pretend that a demigod of the Night Church has discovered a parasite and is fighting him. Even without any deliberate intent, a battle between adjacent pathways and one's own pathway will attract Amon due to the Beander characteristic convergence law. As for when to do it, that's up to you when you're ready. However, Eamon is an extremely cunning master deceiver, and even if it's just an avatar, don't underestimate him. Thank you for your advice. Klein nodded in gratitude, about to continue their previous topic, when he suddenly heard Snow say, "All right, we've talked long enough. The ball has already begun." As his voice fell, the power that had enveloped the two suddenly vanished. Klein then heard Counselor Matched's toast announcing the start of the ball. Turning back, Snow had already walked to a lady's side and was conversing with her familiarly, which made the corner of Klein's mouth twitch slightly. However, he knew very well that Snow was a very experienced Beander. If he wanted to lie or change the subject, he would never do it so stiffly. So, could it be like the Linnerwusi incident before, where he didn't not want to say, but couldn't say? That's right. Although Military Intelligence Section 9 is considered an official Beander organization, it is essentially the Loan Kingdom's intelligence agency. Even the Night Church has practices like swearing an oath of secrecy or playing a role. As an arbiter pathway, which is inherently skilled at formulating rules and decrees, it's quite normal for them to have strict constraints on their members. Thinking of this, Klein abandoned the idea of pressing further. Compared to reality, above the gray fog was undoubtedly a more suitable place to exchange various secrets. Chapter 508, Embarking on a Journey. After the banquet, Klein did not leave immediately. Instead, he controlled his marionette and began to inspect Counselor Matched's mansion. Soon, he found the husk Snow had mentioned, a rat with very human-like behavior patterns. A rat demigod. Klein recalled the demoness cat kept by Mr. Devil, and his mood became a bit complicated for a moment. However, he immediately began to investigate the state of this demigod. It must be said that Mr. Devil's disguise was truly excellent. In both his spirit vision and spirit body threads, the demigod showed a perfectly flawless performance. If Snow hadn't explained it beforehand, he would never have believed that this was actually a husk. Is this the power of paradox? Point at a deer and call it a horse. Klein recalled the illusion Snow had used on Grossel after coming out of Grossel's travels, and his curiosity about Senior Paindrax's paradox pathway grew. According to Snow, Amon's avatars are generally only weak sequence 4, and even aggregated they won't exceed sequence 2. If I can't see through it, it should be able to fool Eamon. I should contact Leonard and ask his old grandpa what to do. Just as Klein was conspiring with Leonard above the gray fog, Snow leisurely walked into a small alley, then opened a summoning door and returned to Black Swan Castle. He hadn't lied to Klein, because he indeed had many things to do. The newly acquired Viscount Panradax's territory could no longer use Earl Hall's staff and needed to be replanned and managed. Military Intelligence Section 9 needed to establish its authority. However, compared to these matters that could be slightly delayed, there was one thing Snow had to complete as soon as possible. That was, sorry for making you wait. In the small dining room of Black Swan Castle, Snow looked at Bernadette, who was eating snacks under the ghost maid's call, and said with a slight apology, "It's fine, I just arrived as well." Bernadette shook her head gently, then directly asked, "What do you need me for?" "Quite a few things. You haven't eaten yet, have you? Let's talk while we eat." Snow didn't give Bernadette a chance to refuse. He waved to the maids, signaling them to serve the dishes, and then said, "First, regarding myself, I hope that if anyone asks you about Rosal, please do not mention me." The fool. Bernadette pondered for a moment and immediately understood who this person was. Snow spread his hands and said, it could also be his spokesperson. "Give me a reason." Bernadette clasped her hands, her tone carrying a hint of Snow's mischievousness. Although Snow knew very well that even if he didn't say anything, Bernadette wouldn't expose his existence, he still went along with the lady's desire to learn more through this opportunity and nodded. "This involves some rituals. Just as a Black Emperor needs to secretly build a mausoleum, both the Fool and Paradox require a ritual where the fewer people who know, the better. Can you understand it this way?" Bernadette nodded lightly, indicating her understanding. As a mystery prior, she was not unfamiliar with rituals and understood that some rituals performed by sequences with the authority of secrecy would require corresponding secrecy. This answer revealed a lot of content, but Bernadette wisely did not continue to ask. After all, she herself was already an angel, and knowing too much could also affect the progress of the ritual. It didn't matter if she guessed it herself, as long as she didn't say it, it wouldn't cause a reaction. But once she asked, whether she got an answer or not, it would trigger a search and affect the ritual. Watching Bernadette close her mouth thoughtfully, Snow immediately felt quite comfortable. It was easy to talk to someone with sufficient mystical knowledge. They understood what to do and what not to do without much explanation. After casually eating a few bites of home-style dishes, Bernadette looked up again, picking a few slices of stir-fried meat from the plate closer to Snow, and spoke again. Besides that, it's goodbye. Snow said casually, as if talking about something completely unrelated to himself. For the next few months, I will disappear for a while. As for when I'll return, earliest September, latest end of November. During this time, I will only leave an avatar in Backland, but he probably won't be able to contact me. If you need to find me during this period, you can have Huang Jiajia contact, devil. Very dangerous. Bernadette seemed to have heard something, and her chopsticks paused. Snow merely smiled slightly and said, "The advancement of a Beyonder itself is full of madness and danger, this is unavoidable. If I really don't come back, I hope you can, remember, me." Quote. Listening to Snow's emphasized, "remember," Bernadette nodded gently, then said, "Remember to bring the information I gave you." "I will." The dining table fell into a brief silence, with only the faint sounds of eating. "Remember to act according to the plan, understood?" In Backland, Snow looked at the stand composed of a puppet, a stand, and a sub-soul, still somewhat uneasy. "Understood." Macro-control Triss and Adelina's relationship, indirectly influence military intelligence Section 9, remotely control the Fosak situation, and transition as smoothly as possible to the Ruford War. The Avatar quickly repeated the plan, but Snow was still a bit uneasy. Although this sub-soul was already the more honest and stable one he had chosen, after advancing to Loren's butterfly, his soul had re-aggregated, transforming from a multi-core processor into a virtual thread. The advantage of this was the ability to freely control the boundary between quality and quantity, adjusting the strength of the sub-soul and consciousness. However, the problem was that the sub-soul's personality was no longer fixed. It might transform from an honest person into a fun seeker at any time. However, since he had made up his mind, he no longer procrastinated. After a final instruction not to forget to take care of his body, he tore open the traveler's door and arrived at the Garter's Islands. He wanted to reach the destination directly, but the divine power in the ruins of the Divine War was too complex. Opening a teleportation in such a place was almost no different from seeking death. The Black Pearl, which had already sailed into the White Whale Sea, had now completed its makeover, transforming into an elegant black steamship, waiting at the port. Snow, with his cat and maid, sailed eastward amidst the sounds of piano music. It wasn't until this moment that Irene, who had almost forgotten what the sea was like, suddenly came to her senses. Looking at the Black Pearl speeding at an exaggerated rate, she said in horror, "Shit, this ship isn't planning to go to that sea of death, is it?" "That's right." Snow's fingertips danced on the piano keys, the Pirates of the Caribbean BGM soaring. Irene's face immediately turned pale. She walked quickly to the ship's rail, and Irene said resolutely, "Is it still not too late to get off the ship now? As long as you dare to jump, it's never too late." Shit. Chapter 509, Tarot Club outside the ruins. At the boundary between illusion and reality, on a sea that seemed to be severed by a giant rift, the Black Pearl, in a bizarre manner, stayed at the end of the real ocean, defying the seawater that cascaded like a waterfall into the dark rift. "Oh, thank goodness, you finally changed your mind." Irene chattered like she had been reborn, looking at the dark rift that seemed capable of swallowing all living beings. Snow rolled his eyes at her, pulled out his pocket watch, and glanced at it. "I'm going to take a nap. When I wake up, we'll enter this sea. I hope you've memorized everything in that booklet." "A nap? It's already afternoon." Irene stared at Snow with a very displeased expression. Then she was surprised to find that the black cat, which had always been inseparable from him, had transformed back into human form. She found a spot to sit down very obediently and began to read quietly. "That's strange." Irene's emotions were disrupted by Lily's peculiar behavior. In her life as a maid, butler, and housekeeper, the person she interacted with most, besides Snow, was this cat. Now, this cat wasn't clinging to him. This nap probably wasn't simple. Realizing this, Irene, who wanted to live a little longer, immediately shut up and also pulled out the ruins of the Divine War Precautions booklet that Snow had given her after boarding the ship and began to read. Although she had already memorized all the content, considering that they were about to enter that damned sea, she decided to review it again, as Snow had said. Ignoring whether Irene was studying diligently, Snow returned to his cabin. He closed the door, set up a spiritual blockade, and as the second hand ticked, a red light began to spread across his vision. Streaks of crimson light shot up within the ancient palace, then subsided again. Before everything could settle, Miss Justice rose without hesitation and bowed to Mr. Fool at the head of the ancient, mottled bronze long table. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." Following Miss Justice's actions, the other members of the Tarot Club also began to rise one after another. When they had all reseated themselves, Miss Hermit lowered her head and said, "Respected Mr. Fool, we still haven't received Russell's diary this week. Queen Mystic hasn't provided a diary for 2 consecutive weeks. Is she still busy with Intis's affairs? That makes sense. If the Sauron faction completely collapses, the Rosal faction, which was previously suppressed, will definitely rise with the momentum. And Queen Mystic should be the top expert of the current Gustav faction, so she must have a lot of things to do." Klein made a guess in his mind, then turned his gaze to Mr. Devil. Sure enough, Mr. Devil still had a diary to submit this time. After a brief pause, the diary's manifestation was complete. Klein picked up the parchment and eagerly began to read. Open black lens bracket as expected of the strongest mysterious organization in history, the foundation of Rose Redemption is truly astonishing. However, did they become powerful because they joined Rose Redemption, or were they powerful enough to qualify for Rose Redemption? Close black lens bracket. Rose Redemption. Why is this suddenly mentioned? This is another mid-section diary entry. Klein looked at the beginning of the diary with some helplessness. The lack of context was secondary. What frustrated him most was that these diary entries were not long. Looking at the diary, which was only half a page long, Klein felt a bit cheated, but he still began to ponder the content. According to Senior Paindrax's previous diary entries, there were 2 possible time points when Rose Redemption might have been mentioned. One was after going to the Forsaken Land of the Gods, and the other was when he found those books related to the true creator. If it's the former, then it was not long after Senior Paindrax obtained his title, and if it's the latter, then it should already be the mid to late stage. Klein thought this to himself and continued to read. Open black lens bracket at the ancient sun god's instigation, his disciples stabbed him in the back. This always sounds like a biblical black humor, like, Judas betrayed Jesus at God's arrangement. I'm increasingly certain that this ancient sun god is very likely a fellow countryman, and the kind of long Aeotian type, close black lens bracket. Quote ? Klein reread it 3 or 4 times, but couldn't make sense of the sentence. Finally, it was only by relying on the phrase, Judas betrayed Jesus, that he barely managed to clarify the relationship. The ancient sun god is the Silver City creator. Rose Redemption betraying him was at his own instigation. Didn't that cleric's spirit say that Saussure was tempted by some existence? Klein still clearly remembered at this moment the cleric whom Little Sun encountered while exploring the City of Silver, who was directly burned to ashes for attempting to utter the name of a king of angels who had already become a god. As an eyewitness to the event, he should not have lied, but why would Senior Paindrax say it was the Silver City creator's instigation? Considering the Bible mentioned by Senior Paindrax, tempted to fall, was the snake, or rather, the devil Satan. But why would the snake in the Garden of Eden know so much? Was it God's arrangement? As a former keyboard warrior, Klein's thoughts immediately began to diverge. Many analyses he had read in his previous life, such as, Judas taking the blame for God, and, Satan taking the blame for God, surfaced in his mind. Through these analyses, he seemed to grasp a key point. The snake tempted Adam and Eve, leading to their expulsion from the Garden of Eden, and humanity was thus able to flourish on earth. Judas betrayed Jesus, which instead allowed Jesus to resurrect and manifest, thus solidifying Jesus' status as a saint. Wait, resurrection. Rosal. Klein felt as if a bolt of lightning had directly pierced through his brain. Based on Senior Paindrax's diary and Russell's diary, Klein was almost certain that Rosal had jumped to the Black Emperor pathway in his later years, seemingly intending to use the resurrection ability of this pathway to cleanse some kind of pollution. What if the Silver City creator had the same idea? He needed a resurrection to cleanse the pollution on himself. But the Silver City creator was clearly dead in the end. Klein frowned, but his eyes continued to scan the parchment. Open black lens bracket. It's a pity, reality is not a feel-good novel after all. No matter how much of a protagonist template he possessed, the Silver City creator still miscalculated human nature. Close black lens bracket. Open black lens bracket. Speaking of which, isn't this history a bit too coincidental? Close black lens bracket. Open black lens bracket. The Silver City creator, Long Aotian, copied various theological classics, became the protagonist of his era, and was assassinated at his own instigation. Close black lens bracket. Open black lens bracket. Rosal, Long Aotian, copied various poems and essays, became the protagonist of his era, and was assassinated at his own instigation. Close black lens bracket. Open black lens bracket. I seriously suspect this is the world's malice towards transmigrators. Close black lens bracket. Open black lens bracket. With the painful lessons of the previous two seniors, I am determined never to become the protagonist of an era. Stay away from all possible pollution. I will not arrange for anyone to assassinate me. Close black lens bracket. Quote. Klein looked at these words speechlessly, his spectator PTSD acting up again. Chapter 510. The Hanged Man's Successful Transformation. After a strong spectator PTSD, Klein calmed down slightly. Emperor Rosal was one thing, but the Silver City creator was a true deity, and very likely a super-powerful god who had shepherded multiple ancient gods. Even the Dragon of Imagination, an ancient god of the spectator pathway, was defeated by him. No spectator should be able to manipulate him. But if it wasn't an accident, then was this some kind of inevitability? When one reaches a sufficiently high sequence, one is bound to face something terrifying, and both Emperor Rosal and the ancient sun god seemed to choose to wash away the contamination through a death. Klein thought of the two resurrection opportunities he had already used and suddenly felt a bit of a loss. However, on second thought, they both seemed to have failed. The creator of the City of Silver, that powerful ancient sun god, left behind only the mad true creator. As for Emperor Rosal, he still hadn't resurrected, but according to Senior Paindrax, it seemed that old Huang still had a chance to be salvaged. I must remain sufficiently vigilant. Klein became even more wary of his path of advancement. He then waved his hand, dispelling the parchment in his hand, leaned back in his chair, and said leisurely, "You may begin." As Mr. Fool spoke, Snow immediately looked at Magician and said, "The weapon with control abilities that you ordered is ready." "Ah, all right." Furs was slightly stunned for a moment before remembering her previous commission for this gentleman to forge a weapon from the dust of an ancient vengeful spirit. She immediately agreed. As Snow spoke, the Tarot Club's transactions resumed. Klein took this opportunity to control the puppet world to clear out Deander items he didn't need. Through the purchases of the Tarot Club members, Klein converted several unused items into liquid funds. As the trading session ended, Mr. Moon cleared his throat and looked at Miss Magician, saying, "I have confirmed that the matter of the abandoned ancient castle in Dreary Forest was a test from within the Sanguine, and they concealed very crucial information." After saying this, it was as if a heavy stone had been lifted from his heart. He was no longer as hesitant, troubled, or embarrassed as he had been a few days prior. He then looked around, at Hermit and Hanged Man, and found that they seemed to have expected it. He secretly sighed at their rich experience, and at the same time, before Miss Magician could speak, he added, "This matter was my mistake. I will refund your £300 for the intelligence fee later, and additionally, compensate you another £300. Furthermore, I will punish the Sanguine who deliberately provided incomplete information." Seeing the proud Mr. Moon apologize so sincerely, Furs weighed it in her heart, then shook her head and said, "This was just a mistake. There's no need for compensation, refunding the intelligence fee is enough." Moon did not insist on this, as he believed punishing Honest was the best compensation. However, as he waited for Miss Magician to bring up the topic of how to punish him, Miss Magician was also waiting for Mr. Moon to speak. For a moment, the two found themselves staring at each other, and the giant dwelling-like palace became unusually quiet. Fortunately, at this moment, the Tarot Club's primary hype man, the beautiful Miss Justice, noticed their awkwardness and immediately adopted a curious posture, saying, "Mr. Moon, how do you plan to punish that sanguine? I plan to lure that sanguine into one of the Earth Mother churches in Backland." Mr. Moon tried to be as vague as possible to conceal his real-world identity, but the problem was that there was only one Earth Mother church in all of Backland. The Star, Justice, Magician, and Judgment, who were familiar with Backland, were momentarily at a loss for how to comment on this silly Mr. Moon. However, very soon, Magician asked with a hint of surprise, "You want the Beyonders of the Earth Mother Church to purify that sanguine?" Ah. Mr. Moon didn't know how to answer for a moment, but just then, Miss Hermit interjected. "The Earth Mother Church has a habit of recruiting sanguine, making them change their faith, and become priests and bishops." To save Mr. Moon's face, Miss Hermit avoided words like captivity as much as possible, which made Mr. Moon feel a bit more at ease. It's just, why was the Star looking at him strangely? Moon noticed the Star's strange gaze and for a moment suspected if this guy knew his real-world self. Seeing that the members of the Tarot Club had completed their preliminary operational plan, Hanged Man, who was looking to transform, saw an opportunity and immediately said, "As members of a secret organization, I believe everything must be thought of on a deeper level." Huh. Moon and the Star looked at Hanged Man with a slight sense of confusion. Justice and Judgment were startled at first, then vaguely grasped something. Hanged Man saw everyone's reactions, a slight smile playing on his lips, feeling that he had finally found a sense of presence in matters other than those involving Little Sun. He immediately continued, "Since the abandoned ancient castle in Dreary Forest was a test, why can't the sanguine presented openly also be a test?" Moon felt ashamed upon hearing this, and the Star suddenly realized. Miss Justice scanned her surroundings, finding the expressions of Hermit, World, and Devil to be natural. She secretly sighed at her lack of experience and immediately asked tentatively, "So, we should temporarily give up on punishment and act only after the sanguine can no longer maintain their secret observation?" With Miss Justice's prompting, Hanged Man gently shook his head and said, "No need to give up, just add a few misleading actions." Saying that, he looked at Moon and said, "First, you directly assign the task of investigating that sanguine to the bounty hunters in Backland, using their existence to cover Miss Judgment's actions. Second, when determining the location of the action, try to be close to a church of an orthodox deity. This can effectively interfere with divination afterward. Third, before Miss Justice and the others deal with that sanguine, you need to perform actions that are sufficiently suspicious but not too obvious, as if you plan to retaliate elsewhere, thereby attracting attention and creating an opportunity. Fourth, after that sanguine is successfully hypnotized, you can then go and guide him." At this point, Alger paused and said, "If there could also be demigod-level anti-divination and anti-prophecy, then the whole matter would be flawless." Hanged Man's words were meticulous, instantly making the hasty action rigorous. The clear logic gave one the feeling of appreciating a well-structured play. The problem now is, where can we find demigod-level anti-divination or anti-prophecy items or talismans? Leonard, the Star, felt greatly enlightened and immediately spoke up. Snow, hearing this, lightly coughed twice and said, "I'll handle the anti-divination aspect. I left a clone in Backland, its combat prowess is only at sequence 5, but if it's just to provide anti-divination, it can effectively block the prying of angels." The Tarot Club was already aware of Mr. Devil's combat strength as a powerful individual capable of killing a descending deity's avatar. However, Miss Justice grasped the key point and looked up at this gentleman she had just met. "Mr. Devil, you are not in Backland right now." "Yes, I recently discovered some things and plan to go to the Forsaken Land of the Gods." Chapter 511 Preparing for the Pilgrimage. The Forsaken Land of the Gods. Little Sun's eyes widened suddenly, and he perked up, breaking free from the feeling of, the excitement is all for others. He asked urgently, "Mr. Devil is coming to the Forsaken Land of the Gods. Is it the Forsaken Land of the Gods where the City of Silver is located?" "That's right. Thanks to Mr. World's help, I deciphered some important information from the documents left by my ancestors, and I need to personally visit the forsaken land of the gods. Snow's tone was no longer his usual relaxed and carefree one. Instead, it carried a seriousness he hadn't even shown when casually mentioning killing a divine avatar. This made the companions of the Tarot Club realize that this gentleman was likely about to undertake something extraordinary. As for Klein, who was mentioned in the conversation, he was slightly stunned at first, then realized that this help probably referred to the items he had brought out of the ancient castle earlier. At that time, Mr. Devil had said that he had collected some secret-related items, and it seemed he had found something in those files. However, compared to the others' exclamations, Derek was particularly concerned. He didn't care about secrets or important information, he only cared about one thing. Mr. Devil knows how to enter and exit the forsaken land of the gods. I do know, but unfortunately, that's not the answer you're looking for, Snow said with a hint of apology. Entering the forsaken land of the gods isn't difficult. As long as you grasp the method, even an ordinary person has a chance to pass through that aisle. But as for how to get out, at least with the methods I have, you would need to be at least a Sequence 3 to bear the cost. Sequence 3. Little Sun immediately became a little disheartened. In the current city of Silver, even the strongest was only a Sequence 4 demigod. Moreover, he didn't want to escape the forsaken land of the gods himself, he wanted to save the entire city of Silver. The Tarot Club fell into a brief silence. However, soon, Mr. Fool, who was pained by the spiritual power being wasted for no reason, controlled the dummy world and moved on to the next topic. Mr. Devil, when we met before, you seemed to be deliberately hiding something. Can you tell us now? Of course. Snow nodded lightly, then said, to investigate some intelligence, I joined Military Intelligence Section 9 and discovered that the Loan Kingdom's royal family is planning something. They have formed a cooperation with organizations like the Demonist Sect and the Psychology Alchemists, and they are trying to deepen the rift between the old and new parties. Of course, because of certain contracts I signed, I cannot actively bring up this topic, nor can I reveal any content outside. Psychology Alchemists, Miss Justice exclaimed, and immediately said, last week, I met Herwin Landbus, a committee member of the Psychology Alchemists Council. He tried to psychologically suggest that I should interact more with different nobles in my daily life, understand their true attitudes on various matters, and then convey them to him. Thanks to the blessing provided by Mr. Fool's angel, I wasn't affected. I originally thought this was an act by the Psychology Alchemists. Could it be that this is also related to the royal family? That should be the case. In fact, I even suspect that Duke Negan's assassination was also at the royal family's behest. After all, Duke Negan, as a pillar of the Conservative Party, died at a truly opportune moment. Snow spoke calmly, but Audrey felt a chill in her heart. Duke Negan and her father, Earl Hall, were the two major pillars of the Conservative Party, one civil and one military. If Duke Negan truly died due to a royal conspiracy, would her father also be assassinated if he didn't act in the direction the royal family desired? I'm only a Sequence 6 hypnotist, I can't help with such matters at all. Audrey felt very heavy-hearted. The Hanged Man immediately comforted her. Even if it's at the royal family's behest, Miss Justice, you don't need to worry too much. The reason they let the Psychology Alchemists handle it is precisely because they don't want to make things public. The major Orthodox churches all have corresponding protective measures for their relatively important believers to prevent them from being assassinated or hypnotized. The fact that Herwin Landbus chose to suggest you observe different nobles itself shows that he is very restrained and dares not go too far, lest he leave traces. Furthermore, you should only be on the periphery of the noble circle and cannot directly participate in various political events. Therefore, relatively speaking, the protection for you and the scrutiny of your situation will not be as strict. This is also why Herwin Landbus approached you. Justice listened to Mr. Hanged Man's detailed analysis and felt a little more at ease. However, she still turned to look at Mr. Devil, hoping for his help. Noticing Miss Justice's gaze, Snow revealed a smile. The contract I signed restricts me from leaking the intentions of certain actions, so I cannot directly warn you. However, we can agree on a secret signal. For example, I can have my clone send you a ball invitation every day. If one day it doesn't arrive, it means there might be a problem. At that time, you can secretly go to my house and peek at my Russell's diary. After all, the contract I signed doesn't stipulate that I cannot write secrets in my Russell's diary. Of course, I will strictly keep secrets, but don't you have that key? To avoid arguments, there are actually similar clauses, but the final interpretation right belongs to the Augustus family, and Snow has an Augustus by his side who can interpret the clauses. That's possible. Audrey immediately felt reassured upon hearing this, then looked at the top of the bronze long table with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Mr. Fool, is that all right? I will try my best to collect Russell's diary entries later. Yes. Klein nodded casually, while secretly thinking that he had learned another trick. Afterward, World discussed with the Star and Hermit respectively the matters of hunting Aemon and meeting Queen Mystic. When the Tarot Club was about to end, Little Sun asked how to create safe, pure darkness. Although Snow had a complete solution to this problem, he had no intention of interfering, because he knew very well that Little Sun would probably not accept his plan. With Mr. Fool's words, "That's all for today," the Tarot Club members rose and bowed under the guidance of Miss Justice. As the gray fog slowly dispersed, Snow returned to the Black Pearl's cabin. Letting out a long breath, Snow unlocked the spiritual seal in the room, picked up Heaven Manufacturing inserted in the phonograph, and walked out of the cabin door. The retreat has been prepared. It's time to begin this pilgrimage journey. Accompanied by Irene's expression of utter resignation, Snow picked up Lily, who had transformed back into a cat, and piloted the Black Pearl into that illusory and dangerous sea area. Chapter 512. Desperate and Hard Training. So this is what the night in the ruins of the Divine War looks like. Gazing at the sky that had suddenly turned pitch black, Snow sat at the bow of the Black Pearl, his fingers gently dancing on the piano keys, playing an ethereal nocturne amidst the endless, jarring whispers. Although he had passed through the sea area shrouded in golden light and filled with sighs, Snow did not touch the corpse. Or rather, at his current level, he was not qualified to touch that corpse. The incomplete remains of the ancient sun god, even after losing the blasphemy slate and the Beander characteristic, were still the flesh and blood of a quasi-outer deity. Without reaching the angel level, even with Saphira protecting him, Snow dared not make contact with it. His purpose in coming to these ruins of the God War, as he had said at the Tarot Club, was to go to the forsaken land of the gods. However, it wasn't to gather information, but to retrieve an item. An item that couldn't, or rather, was very difficult to bring through the door of sacrifice. This journey was long and tedious. Not to mention the trip to the forsaken land of the gods, just the time required to travel back and forth within the ruins of the God War was estimated to be over 2 months. Such a long period of time, Snow naturally couldn't let it go to waste. Playing the Dragon of Cal, or rather, countering the side effects of the Dragon of Cal, was the homework he assigned himself. And the method of playing was to not sleep at night. This might sound like a joke in other places, but in these illusory ruins filled with the Evernight goddess's divine power, it was an extremely dangerous thing. In this night, which contained mysterious dreams, if one didn't sleep, they could disappear at any moment. But Snow, conversely, used this pressure, because the Dragon of Cal, in essence, did not exist. Because it did not exist, it naturally wouldn't disappear. But if he truly allowed non-existence, Snow would instead disappear due to his self-cognition. Therefore, in this night, Snow had to repeatedly change his self-cognition. Under normal circumstances, he had to recognize his own existence to ensure he wouldn't disappear, but when the hidden power in the night was triggered, he had to immediately switch to non-existence to evade the night's secrecy. Constantly alternating cognition was a very dangerous thing. Even though Snow had advanced for some time, he could still mess up at any moment. And this sense of walking on a tightrope was the best whetstone for sharpening Snow's will. As for truly messing up, he left a clone, a decoy, and some memories. If he truly disappeared, he would try to revive himself through the memories of his ancestors in Black Swan Castle, his clone in Backland, or his companions in the Tarot Club. Of course, Snow himself wasn't too confident about whether this revival would be effective. It wasn't that he couldn't leave a more thorough fallback, but once there was a clear fallback, the effect of this journey would be greatly reduced. Just like a certain wealthy individual climbing a wall, the inability to escape was only because he was tied to a safety rope. Only by abandoning the safety and going all in could true success be possible. After all, cowardice and weakness were obstacles that self-cognition had to face, and the Sequence 2 advancement ritual offered no guarantees whatsoever. If one didn't even dare to contend with their own cognition, how could they succeed when facing the cognition of countless spectators in the future? Tens of minutes later, black and white alternated again. The sky instantly switched to midday. There was no sun, no clouds, and the light, as if shining directly from another dimension, dyed the entire world golden. Snow stopped playing, opened a box placed in the corner of the deck. As layers of spiritual wall were removed, the crystal bottle inside was once again exposed to the air. The light between heaven and earth seemed to spontaneously gather towards that crystal bottle, while Snow leaned against it, watching Irene and Lily interact. This was also the fundamental reason he brought them on board. If he had to complete this journey, which could potentially exceed 3 months, alone, it would be very difficult to anchor his self-cognition. After all, human cognition is achieved through comparison. If there are no others, then how can one cognize oneself? Lily blindly ate fish, Irene was nervous. Against the backdrop of the two, Snow gradually found his rightful place. He relaxed his mind, retaining only a basic cognition of himself, allowing the tense emotions from the night to slightly ease. Although she was terrified of this sea area, Irene still bravely stayed on the deck, chatting idly with the carefree Lily while cautiously scanning her surroundings. Although the notes on the ruins of the God War that Snow gave her contained many things she shouldn't look at or listen to, she didn't dare to hide in the cabin like an ostrich. This was because the day and night cycles in the ruins of the God War were very disordered, perhaps 3 or 4 hours, perhaps tens of minutes. If she couldn't fall asleep immediately when it got dark, she couldn't guarantee that she wouldn't disappear. In contrast, Lily seemed very open-minded. She had a unique feline laziness. If it weren't for eating fish, she could sleep for several day and night cycles straight. I wonder if Klein has made his move yet. Snow glanced at the golden crystal bottle, his mind wandering freely, but after a brief emotional release, he reined in his thoughts, actively cutting off the idea of contacting his clone. To ensure the effectiveness of this self-cognition, he severed all connections with the outside world, including his split soul and decoy, as well as his praying believers. All prayer responses and spell preparations were left to the monkey split soul acting as a signal base station in Black Swan Castle. After all, while anchors could help stabilize the self, in Snow's deliberate attempt to train and cognize himself, the cognition transmitted by anchors could very likely become a poison that polluted his self-cognition. He hadn't forgotten the existence behind his Sephira, that being which was even difficult to remember. I am not a paradox, not the omnipotent Mr. Devil, but just an ordinary transmigrator with a slightly larger golden finger. I must not be deceived by the strength reflected in the eyes of others, I must recognize my own weakness. Snow cautioned himself in his heart. It wasn't that he didn't understand this principle before, but only when he truly had the strength did he have the right to face his own weakness. When one is weak, even a false strength is a necessary disguise. The crystal bottle was once again filled with gold. Snow tightened the cap and opened an empty bottle of the same design next to it. The direct sunlight in the sky seemed to pour into the bottle through an invisible funnel, dyeing the runes on the outer wall of the crystal bottle a faint gold. Just as Snow was about to ask Lily for a grilled fish, the sky once again darkened. Without any hesitation, Snow flipped the box closed. As layers of spiritual wall once again sealed the box containing many crystal bottles, Lily and Irene also found comfortable positions and quickly fell asleep. Having completed the sealing of the sunlight collection bottles, Snow returned to the piano. However, this time, he did not play, but simply gazed quietly at the night, staring into the distance in infinite tranquility. Chapter 513. Arrival at the God-forsaken land. Time in the ruins of the Divine War is extremely chaotic. It doesn't just manifest as disordered day-night cycles, but also genuinely affects the flow of time itself. Whether it's a pocket watch timed by springs, or a Beander clock powered by Beander characteristic, even the speed of digestion after eating, all gradually lose their accuracy in this sea area. Moreover, due to the extreme danger of the illusory sea area, Snow even took a leave from the Tarot Club, which made it even harder for him to judge the exact time. He couldn't remember how long he had been drifting on this sea, only knowing that 5 boxes of crystal bottles used to collect sun divine power were already full, and the whisper in his ears grew increasingly stronger. The essence of this illusory sea area is actually a dream of the Silver City creator before he died. At the moment of his impending death, he was influenced by the power of the night, plunged into a dream, dreaming of himself torn to pieces, his blood staining the sea. Because White Creator himself possessed the authority of a visionary, at the moment of his true death, a part of his body, carrying residual divine power, fell into that death dream and merged with a part of reality, forming this special sea area that exists between illusion and reality. The giant court standing on the opposite cliff in that dream was actually the last scene the ancient sun god saw before his death. Everything around was the nightmare of the ancient sun god's death, only the harsh, chaotic whisper swirling above this illusory sea area was the murmur of the true creator's birth. Under the guidance of the true creator's whisper and the direction of heaven manufacturing, Snow docked the Black Pearl in a safe zone, where various divine powers intertwined. Here, there was unimaginable high temperature and an ocean dyed golden by the ancient sun god's blood, but it was not dangerous. As the core area of the ruins of the divine war, this sea area was divided into sections by the conflict of various divine powers, and naturally, there were some safe zones where divine powers achieved a fragile balance. However, such safe zones are not long-lasting. Perhaps today's balance will be broken tomorrow by a stray monster, a slightly larger wave, or even a slight fluctuation in the dream world. But for now, as long as one doesn't explore carelessly, there won't be any problems. Snow rehung heaven manufacturing around his neck, looking at this sea area dyed golden by the blood of a deity, but he had no intention of collecting the divine blood, even though every drop of that divine blood was equivalent to a main ingredient of sequence 4. After checking all the crystal bottles, tightening every cap, and resealing the boxes, as night descended again, Snow did not continue to resist the hidden power this time, but quickly entered a state of meditation. As the white mist slowly spread before his eyes, Snow gradually awakened and began to recognize his dream. At this moment, he was atop a mountain, with a black monastery-style building behind him, just like the last time he entered this dream. As his gaze passed through boulders and trees, there was an open cliff, and opposite the cliff, a mountain covered with countless palaces, towers, and majestic city walls stood there. Snow turned his head and soon saw Lily and Irene. At this time, Lily was gnawing on a dried snow codfish as big as a shark, while Irene was facing a wooden stake, continuously spewing various insults. Snow made a mental note to settle a score with this red maid, and had no intention of waking the two of them, so he just held their hands and walked towards the cliff. As his steps gradually approached the cliff, Heaven Manufacturing, hanging on his chest and entering the dream with him, suddenly trembled slightly. Unlike the last time he entered the dream, Heaven Manufacturing retained its spirituality this time. The trembling of Heaven Manufacturing intensified, and a series of whispers slowly grew from faint to louder. When it was almost as loud as normal speaking volume, Snow also began to chant. The creator of all, the ruler behind the veil of shadows, the fallen nature of all living beings, I implore your listening, I implore your gaze, I implore you to open the door to your kingdom. As the true creator's honorific name resounded in the dream world, the sea of clouds separating the two peaks began to boil. The projection of the distant giant court converged, and the dim yellow light began to twist into a beam, forming an orange-red pillar of light that connected the two peaks, creating a narrow passage above the deep rift valley. Snow, holding Lily and Irene's hands, walked on that narrow, thin, and seemingly incredibly fragile twilight passage, but the feeling underfoot was incredibly solid and firm. On both sides of the passage were magnificent landscapes, and ahead of the passage were majestic mountains and the grand giant court. Snow, walking above the sea of clouds with two beauties by his hands, was mentally very tense. As he stepped down from the end of the twilight passage and his feet landed on the mountain rock, a massive gray-blue door, covered with symmetrical patterns, symbols, and markings, and over 10 meters tall, simultaneously appeared in his vision. Snow took a deep breath, looked down at the now quiet Heaven Manufacturing, and silently stepped forward. The moment his hands pressed against the great door, he pushed it open with almost no effort. Actually, one could have entered silently using an apprentice's ability, but Snow had no intention of hiding himself. As the great door opened, a gaze truly fell upon Snow. This gaze carried a hint of chaos and madness within its majesty, yet maintained a strange balance. Snow was not unfamiliar with this, it was precisely the true creator's gaze. However, this time, this gaze had a far greater sense of presence than any previous time, even more distinct than during Backland's Great Smog, when the gaze descended due to the collective will of hundreds of thousands of people in Backland's East Borough chanting hymns. Is this the true feeling of being gazed upon by a deity? Snow gently moved his shoulders, without the slightest fear or hesitation. If, when he first transmigrated, he only felt fear and wariness towards the true creator, then now, he and this crazy senior transmigrator had already had many interactions. Although he couldn't sincerely call himself a devout believer, nor could he use an intimate word like friend to describe the two, the word companion was certainly fitting. Taking Lily and Irene's hands, Snow stepped through the door under the true creator's gaze. Following a dizzying, spirit-tearing pain, he suddenly jolted awake. When his feet again felt solid and stable, he had awakened from the dream. He, Lily, and Irene were standing with their real bodies on a beach illuminated by twilight, with black sand and rocks, and deep blue waves crashing against the shore, but eerily, without making any sound. The Black Pearl was now docked not far from this silent sea, seemingly ready to depart again if one boarded it. But Snow knew very well that here, only those allowed by the true creator were qualified to re-enter that dream passage. Fortunately, he happened to be one of those holding a ticket. Reaching out to gently caress the vertical pupil on Heaven Manufacturing's chest, Snow tapped his chest 4 times towards the east, then gave Lily and Irene, who were still confused, a "follow me" look, and stepped into the dim yellow light. Chapter 514, the clone seems to have realized something. In Intis, Trier, at St. Gustav Cathedral, a brief press conference was underway. After a month of research and testing, the machinery church had completed an order for Snow. Mr. Snow, these are the design blueprints for the radio and broadcasting station production line you requested. The sample has passed testing, and if needed, production can begin very soon. The Archbishop of St. Gustav Cathedral placed a thick stack of blueprints on the table, a hint of joy in his tone. Even though the Steam and Machinery Church was more enthusiastic about spreading faith through schools and factories than through preaching, they still understood the influence of broadcasting. If this technology were popularized, with every Machinery Church cathedral installing a broadcasting station to daily propagate the Machinery Church's ideals to commoners and even offer broadcast courses, it would undoubtedly greatly expand the Machinery Church's influence. Thank you for your hard work. Snow's clone, who had come to inspect, picked up a simple radio placed nearby. Adhering to the consistent style of the Machinery Church, the device looked like a metal box with a joystick. Having already seen Miss Justice's hand-cranked flashlight, Snow's clone was not surprised. He gripped the joystick and cranked it more than 10 times, then twisted the central dial. The prototype had no frequency modulation function. Once the power was connected, there was a series of static, and then a distorted, mechanical voice emerged from the box. Gears are a very classic structure. By calculating the pitch and radius, we can easily. Snow's clone gave the Archbishop, who wore a proud expression, a speechless look, realizing that the other party seemed completely unaware of how strange this program was. However, the Machinery Church's gear aesthetic did not affect their technical prowess. After quickly reviewing the design blueprints and assembly line plan, Snow's clone nodded and said, "The functionality is complete, but I hope to add an independent frequency modulation function to it. Although the patent currently belongs to our 2 parties, once the channels are established, there will certainly be more than 1 or 2. Rather than overhauling the production line then, it's better to prepare from the start. Of course, this is just a sample with a locked frequency to avoid the hassle of tuning. The design for that is very simple." The Machinery Church Archbishop looked understanding. Snow's clone didn't waste any more words. After some negotiations about setting up factories and sales methods, Snow's clone and Mr. A, who had already become the Saint of Light, left St. Gustav Cathedral. According to the original plan, prepare the broadcasters. In the early stages, don't rush to preach. First, use various news items to cultivate listening habits. You can follow the method of the Fables book I gave you earlier, writing short stories with hidden doctrines to help the public understand and identify with our ideals. This will make future missionary work much easier. However, remember not to disparage other churches, as it's not yet time to show our hand. With the help of the machinery church here in Intis, things should go smoothly. There's no rush for FOSAC, just slowly penetrate with a commercial model. As for Backland, I will make arrangements with Military Intelligence Section 9. Coincidentally, His Majesty the King must also be eager for his voice to reach his citizens more easily now. Snow's clone recounted the plan given by his main body before he left, one by one. The Saint of Light, Mr. A, carefully noted Snow's words, and only after he finished speaking did he say, "Recently, the Sun heretics have become active again. Our high-end combat power is insufficient. After all, they still have 2 angels. There's no rush for that. Bonava Gustav, His Eminence of the Machinery Church, is in Trier. As for the future, I am preparing a sealed artifact that can serve as a vessel for a divine descent. This will take about 3 months. We just need to get through this period." Snow's clone recalled the half-finished item his main body was working on, feeling a twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Viscount Panradaxes, what can I do for you?" Inside a cafe on William Street, Snow's clone, who had rushed back to Backland with the samples, sat in a private room with Duchess Georgina. Looking at the newly appointed Viscount, Duchess Georgina always had a strange feeling. She always felt that this person in front of her wasn't as annoying as before. "I received news that the Machinery Church in Intis has developed a set of evangelism systems. I believe His Majesty the King would like this system." The corner of Snow's clone's mouth curved into an arc as he explained the functions of the radio and broadcasting station. As someone privy to Joe III's plan for godhood, Georgina immediately realized the value of this system, but she didn't show it, merely nodding lightly and saying, "Sounds very good. Do you have a sample?" "I brought a few radio samples, but the broadcasting station samples are too large and difficult to transport. However, Lowen itself also has the Machinery Church preaching, so I believe His Majesty the King can easily obtain finished products from them." Snow's clone spread his hands, his expression confident. Duchess Georgina nodded and said, "All right, I will report this matter to His Majesty. Regardless of success, it will be counted as your contribution. If you have any requests, you may make them, and the royal family will try its best to fulfill them. In that case, if His Majesty the King adopts this system, I hope to establish a news broadcasting station. Well, you know, I own shares in several newspapers, and I myself am a novelist." Snow clasped his hands together, seemingly unconcerned that the other party might disagree. Georgina, of course, had no reason to refuse. Compared to demands like a Sequence 1 sealed artifact or a Sequence 2 potion formula, such a request was almost meager. However, Georgina ultimately remembered that she was not the one to make the decision. She did not immediately agree but nodded and said, "I will report your request to His Majesty." After bidding farewell to Georgina, Snow's clone, who had been running around all day, returned home. He picked up a cup of hot tea, and as a puff of hot air escaped his mouth, his entire being became lazy. Why can't the main body leave? No, it should leave a clone at every stronghold. Snow's clone complained, put down his teacup, found a comfortable position on the sofa, and began to clear his mind. However, just as he felt drowsiness creeping in and was about to take a nap, the door was suddenly knocked. Then, a ghost maid walked over and said to the clone, whose face already showed a hint of murderous intent, "Master, Mr. Emmeline White has arrived." "Damn it." Snow's clone sprang up from the sofa with a grimace, intense anger flashing and then fading. His original fatigue immediately transformed into elegance and composure. He gritted his teeth and emitted a voice as smooth as possible from his throat. "Please let him in." At this point, the corner of his mouth suddenly curved. In that moment, he seemed to somewhat understand his main body's unpleasant personality. With such an exhausting daily life, wouldn't life be too boring if one didn't find some fun? Chapter 515, Meeting the Emperor. True. Along the foot of the mountain, Snow stepped through the solidified twilight and circled to the front of the giant court. Following this small path, passing through the decaying forest, going through the barren tunnel, and taking the ultra-ancient elevator to the top of the mountain, where one side was a spire and the other was a round tower main hall. Avoiding the lingering spirits of the giant guards, pushing open the door of the giant court, he could meet Saucerier's evil spirit and see the first blasphemy slate. It was said that it was formed from the corpse of the first god Almighty and possessed the power to connect to the Chaos Sea. For Snow, Saucerier's evil spirit was not a troublesome enemy. However, just as he attempted to ascend the tall, giant-sized steps, heaven manufacturing suddenly trembled uncontrollably. Immediately, the gaze that had been fixed on him since entering the forsaken land of the gods became slightly heavier. Then, a thought spontaneously arose in his mind. It's not time yet. This was a divine oracle, different from the usual murmurs or ramblings. It was an incredibly clear expression of consciousness. Snow's original attempt to move forward stiffened, and he immediately understood. The forsaken land of the gods was no secret to true gods. Leaving aside those without direct vested interests, the gazes of Wind, Wisdom, and White Creator had never left that door. They all wanted to obtain the first blasphemy slate, gain the opportunity to connect to the Chaos Sea, and were all very curious about the current state of Saucerier's evil spirit. Although Harabergen had already expressed his stance through 001, he had never been a trustworthy god. He would always side with the victor and would not miss the opportunity to become the victor. This was the same reasoning as Snow returning 008 to Adam, because no matter the final outcome, Adam had to become a god. Only then could they suppress the three gods. Is it excessive self-awareness caused by self-cognition? I even forgot about something like this. Snow shook his head slightly and turned around without hesitation, walking in the opposite direction. As the three of them left the giant court, the decaying aura that suppressed all power disappeared along with the solidified twilight. Irene, relieved, began to scrutinize this barren land shrouded in darkness and lightning, and soon after, made a discovery. There seems to be a light over there. Are those humans? Snow looked in the direction Irene indicated. In the endless darkness, faint yellow lights illuminated the end of his vision. With his extraordinary sight, he could clearly see the makeshift camp formed by huge rocks and stone pillars, and the figures moving back and forth within the light. However, Snow had no intention of approaching. He merely sensed it briefly, then changed direction, avoiding the camp. Could it be that they aren't humans, but rather a monster lair of some kind of variant? Do monsters also make fires? Irene, who had been bickering with Lily, became overly stifled after Lily stopped talking. Now that they had left the decaying aura of the giant court, she immediately became a bit of a chatterbox. Snow glanced at her, reached out, and stroked the somewhat trembling Lily, but said nothing. The glowing camp was the afternoon town camp of the City of Silver, but Snow did not intend to interact with them. After all, it shouldn't be him who saves the City of Silver. This was not a question of fatalism or anything similar, but rather a requirement for Mr. Fool's advancement ritual. Besides, this path of redemption should be walked by them themselves. To go forward now and say that the Creator, who hadn't responded for thousands of years, had been resurrected, could respond again, could save them, and that they could leave this place simply by praying sincerely, that would not be salvation, but an insult to the City of Silver's thousands of years of history. If there were no other choice, naturally one would save a life before treating an illness. But now, the City of Silver could forge another path. Drawing an arc across the barren land, amidst the continuous lightning, Snow once again returned to his original direction. Yes, he had a direction, and this direction was the direction of the true Creator's gaze. Following the Lord's gaze, one could reach the Lord's divine kingdom. This was the only beacon for all Aurora Order members who came to the ruins of the God War to search for the true Creator's sanctuary. And following this beacon, the destination it pointed to was, naturally, the true Creator's location. That's right, Snow came to the forsaken land of the gods this time to meet the true Creator himself. After all, for his own godhood ritual, and also for White Creator, he needed to borrow some components from the true Creator. And such items with a divine imprint could easily cause accidents through sacrifice bestowal channels, while the Saphira channel would easily wash away the imprint. After much consideration, Snow finally decided to go himself. Admittedly, the forsaken land of the gods was full of various dangers, but in reality, most of the monsters here could not cause substantive harm to Snow. The very few existences stronger than him also did not dare to be enemies with him, a favored one of the true Creator, in this land. The only real thing to guard against was the divine power dispersed across this land. The monsters spawned by the true Creator's fallen authority were irrelevant, but the hidden authority that could make people disappear in darkness was a very troublesome thing. Although Snow, being an insider, could deal with this problem through the Evernight Goddess's holy emblem, he chose to use his own cognition to contend with secrecy for the sake of honing his own will. Of course, just because he didn't use it didn't mean Lily and Irene didn't. These two reference points, which provided him with positioning, were still well protected by him. Actually, logically speaking, Snow could have already attended the Tarot Club by now, but since this trip to the Forsaken Land of the Gods involved too many internal secrets that Mr. Fool shouldn't know, he still had no intention of ending his leave. After walking for an unknown amount of time, Snow, who was stealthily moving through the darkness, suddenly raised his arm. Lily, who had recovered her vitality and was bickering with Irene, immediately shut her mouth. Irene, though a half-beat slower, also held her breath. As the noisy sounds instantly ceased, the thump, thump, thump of footsteps slowly emerged in their ears. Illuminated by the occasional flashes of lightning, a tall figure appeared in their sight. He was nearly 2 meters 30 tall, with a slightly hunched back, completely white hair, wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, scars around his mouth, and was clad in a dark black clerical robe. He was a quite elderly man. His eyes were deep and calm, his steps slow and powerful. Although his pace seemed slow, in the blink of an eye, he had already arrived nearby. Without Heaven Manufacturing's introduction, Snow had already recognized the newcomer. He extended his right hand, tapping 4 times on his chest in the order of down, up, right, left, drawing an inverted cross, then bowed slightly and said, "Good day, Angel of the Holy Words. Good day, Sage of Pleasure." A slightly aged voice came from the other party. Although he looked incredibly old, this angel possessed incredibly vigorous life force. He tapped 4 times on his chest in the same order, then slowly straightened his back, speaking in a serious tone. "The Lord already knows your intention. Follow me." Saying this, he looked at Irene and Lily with his deep, profound eyes again, and said in a low voice, "They will stay here. The Lord will grant them protection." Chapter 516 Changes. The Forsaken Land of the Gods knows no years. When the lightning once again became dense, the silvery light made the darkness recede slightly, and the city of Silver, as if enveloped by a dim yellow glow, slowly came to life. Derek climbed out of bed and instinctively reached for the greatsword beside him. Ever since he triggered a side effect by being disarmed by a certain Dawn Paladin, he had gained a deeper understanding of the open black lens bracket rebellious curse close black lens bracket of this sword. After confirming that the blade of rebellion was by his side, Derek breathed a slight sigh of relief, checked the candles in the room, and then began to put on his equipment. He didn't have an exploration mission today and planned to continue practicing at the training ground. But the moment he pushed open his door, a strong, undeniable sound exploded in his ears. It wasn't a sound wave truly generated by vibration, nor was it a method like mental communication, but rather something closer to a sensation. Although he saw nothing and heard nothing, Derek felt as if he heard a pained grunt, and as he understood that sensation, a strong pain emanated from his chest. Not just Derek, but the entire city of Silver, the entire Forsaken Land of the Gods, whether human or monster, as long as they still possessed the concept of pain, felt an intense pain at that moment. And Derek, due to the side effect of the blade of rebellion, endured double the pain. The pain of skin being torn open, muscles ripped apart, and bones broken made Derek's body tremble violently. Even though the pain came and went quickly, the lingering phantom pain still left him with a lingering fear. What was that just now? Derek absently reached out to touch his left rib, as if a lingering pain remained there. And just as he was wondering if he had encountered some curse, the alarm and assembly bell of the city of Silver suddenly rang. Only at this moment did Derek realize that the previous pain probably wasn't directed only at him, but he still didn't go out immediately. Instead, he closed the door, clasped his hands together, rested them against his chin, and silently prayed. The fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious master above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who controls good luck, I beseech your listening, I beseech your gaze. Just now, I seemed to hear a phantom groan from the northeast, and then I felt an intense pain. After slowly recounting what had happened, Derek humbly indicated that he hoped to receive an examination from Mr. Fool. Only then, with the second bell ringing, did he rush to the training ground for assembly. Although he knew that the City of Silver would definitely conduct a comprehensive inspection, just thinking of the old man who had been parasitized by Aemon, he couldn't help but feel a certain distrust towards the City of Silver's inspection methods. Meanwhile, in the northeast of the City of Silver, in a rugged mountainous area, under a sky interwoven with thunder and darkness, a slightly strange song suddenly rang out. A forgotten era in history. Past events surge forward. He uses silence to tell of glory's decline. The sun sinks into the sea. The afterglow resonates. Crows fly back. Guarding the outer deity's remains. Accompanied by the song, Snow's figure slowly emerged from the shadows. At this time, he was not much different from when he left, except for the tune he was humming and his slightly haggard face, and the heaven manufacturing on his chest which was stained with a trace of gloom. Lily was no stranger to this inverted cross, but at this moment it looked completely different from before. Although the structure, ornamentation, and the iconic pink vertical pupil were all identical, the original bone-like paleness now had a metallic gray sheen, and beneath this luster, a mass of shadow seemed to be lurking. And the small figure hanging upside down on it now looked even more lifelike. Although it still showed no signs of movement, anyone who looked at it would feel that what was hanging there was actually a living person. Is the matter finished? Irene, whose pain in her left rib had just subsided, asked somewhat nervously. Although there was no evidence, she was sure that the intense pain earlier was definitely related to this guy. Snow was still humming that strange tune, but his voice rang out in Irene's mind. Without saying much, he seemed to be guiding something, maintaining the melody while moving towards the giant court. At this moment, Lily only felt a strange sensation lingering around Snow, but it didn't originate from Snow himself. It was like the feeling of wearing a stand. Is he possessed? Meow. As soon as Lily spoke, Irene on the side immediately pounced to cover her mouth, then looked at Snow warily. After realizing he had no reaction, she whispered, "Are you trying to die? It's one thing if he willingly bears it, but if he's really possessed, do you think we can handle it? But is it okay for you to say that? Meow." Probably. Irene cautiously looked at Snow, who was still singing, and said somewhat uncertainly, while Snow was on his tour concert, in the forsaken land of the gods, in Backland, at the home of the furniture merchant Humphrey, Audrey once again met Herwin Landbus. As the two looked at each other, Audrey's eyes suddenly became dazed, then turned to understanding, as if waking from a long dream. But she didn't seem surprised by this, only greeting him with impeccable etiquette. "Good afternoon, Mr. Landbus." "Good afternoon, our girl." Herwin Landbus's address made Audrey want to roll her eyes. Although there was a barrier left by Mr. Devil, doing so shouldn't be discovered, but considering the avatar left by Mr. Devil recently, it's probably better to conserve its use. Herwin Landbus looked at Audrey for a few seconds but didn't find any abnormalities, so he said with an undiminished smile, "You've done well during this period. As a reward, we've decided to give you the Dreamwalker potion formula." Saying that, he took out a neatly folded piece of paper and placed it on the coffee table, pushing it towards the young girl in front of him. As Audrey read the formula, Herwin Landbus gave a brief explanation of the ritual. However, the young girl in front of him seemed to want to undertake an adventure, which he didn't mind. Instead, he finally guided the conversation to the main topic. "This time there's another task for you to do. If you complete it well, we will provide all the materials for the Dreamwalker potion." Indeed. Audrey sighed inwardly, but still, as usual, asked without any resistance, "What is it?" "Find out the attitudes of your father Earl Hall, the current Duke Negan, Admiral Emilius, and other nobles towards a relatively large war." War? Audrey recalled what Mr. Devil had said before, feeling a little complex in her heart. She didn't hide her confusion and unfamiliarity with this word, making the expression of a naive but kind noble lady, accepting the task, and then, in turn, reported it to Mr. Fool. According to Mr. Devil, the Sunset Otaku group and the subordinate psychology alchemists should be inclined to promote war, which aligns with the tide of history. Above the gray fog, Klein, who had just given Little Sun a comprehensive check-up, looked at Audrey's prayer content and sighed deeply. At the same time, he remembered the avatar left by Mr. Devil, and rubbed his temples with a headache. "Mr. Devil, when will you be back?" Chapter 517, Search. In Backland, at 22 Peverell Street, Klein, who intended to participate in the Lowen Charity Scholarship Foundation, had just entered when he saw Miss Audrey Hall and several foundation staff members coming down the stairs and heading towards the door. The noble young lady was dressed very simply today, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, with only a plain pouch at her waist, holding a wallet and an exquisite but not overly ornate folding fan. Her dress was light green, with only a ruffled trim at the cuffs, devoid of lace and tassels. "Good morning, Miss Audrey." Klein familiar removed his hat and bowed, then nodded to the staff members and wished them a good morning. Only after Audrey responded did he casually ask, "Where are you preparing to go?" In Klein's impression, Miss Justice's main job was to solicit donations from the ladies and gentlemen of high society. Such an improperly dressed situation was extremely rare for her. Hearing Klein's tone, Audrey immediately realized that Mr. World was likely using this identity at the moment, and she responded with a slight smile. "To visit various universities and check on the students we previously helped." At this point, Audrey remembered the psychological issues Mr. World had faced before, and she winked playfully, then with a more obvious smile, she said, "Mr. Robin, would you like to come along? To see the children? Well, some are already young adults, whose fates have had a chance to change because of your ideas and kindness." Hearing Audrey's words, Klein hesitated for a moment, then chose to follow his psychiatrist's advice. Of course, this was also because he himself was somewhat concerned about the current progress. "That's an invitation I cannot refuse," Klein replied. They left the building, and at Miss Audrey's suggestion, they chose a trackless public carriage. This made Klein understand Audrey's attire slightly better, while also feeling a bit surprised. "You seem quite accustomed to it." Although lacking an object, Audrey immediately understood Mr. World's meaning. She glanced at the nearby foundation staff and then said with a smile, "It's not the first time. It's not possible for me to take my own carriage every time we go out while they use public transport." At this point, Audrey somewhat sheepishly recounted her first experience on a public carriage, where she pulled out a £1 banknote and was awkwardly told by the conductor to buy a newspaper. However, the topic of the poor did not last long. Under Miss Justice's deliberate guidance, the two once again shifted the conversation back to the beneficiaries. Amidst their casual chat, the public carriage slowly stopped, and they arrived at the first stop of their visit, Backland University of Technology. Based on Audrey's status and Kid Robin's social connections, they directly met the president of this newly formed university, a resident of 100 Birkeland Street, Mr. Portland Mormont. After a brief chat, Miss Audrey suggested they begin their work. Hearing this request, the president showed a smile like a child wanting to display his handicraft, and nodded. "Perfect. There's a competition today, and many of the aided students are participating. We can go see their work." As if reading the desire to be seen from Mr. Portland's smile, Audrey also showed considerable enthusiasm, asking with a touch of curiosity, "What kind of competition is it?" A machine design competition. Besides its practicality, it's also very interesting." Mr. Portland smiled as he pushed open the office door. After passing through the school corridor, the three, along with a group of foundation staff, arrived at an open space. It was already crowded with students, and the noisy sounds and cheering made one feel like joining in to see the excitement. "Is that Mr. Flammy Cage?" Suddenly, Audrey's gaze locked onto a portly figure of Fosac descent. Klein turned his head and indeed saw this gentleman sitting on a raised platform, similar to a judging panel, watching the area surrounded by people with great interest. Klein was naturally familiar with this gentleman. In some ways, he was even his business partner. However, why was this automobile magnate here, and did he look like a competition judge? Mr. Cage is also very interested in this competition. He is also the second largest sponsor of this competition. President Portland wore a smile. As they approached, the students who recognized the esteemed president's arrival made way, allowing everyone to see the enclosed arena. And the moment he saw the situation in the arena, Klein's eyes suddenly changed twice, for he saw an incredibly familiar figure, and incredibly familiar things. Withdrawing his gaze from that person, Klein was about to subtly inquire, but he heard Miss Audrey speak first. "What is this? A miniature steam-powered car race?" We call these simulated power cars. President Portland's face held a hint of pride as he pointed to the miniature track that looked like a scaled-down version of the Super Invincible roller coaster. Note: a landmark, entertainment project, in Roselle's Ultimate Thrill Park, and the palm-sized cars racing on the track, his eyes flashing with childlike excitement. Besides the power being provided by the machinery church, the grinding and manufacturing of parts, the assembly and fine-tuning of the race cars are all done by the students themselves. Besides exercising the students' practical abilities, it also fully brings out their creativity. In just 1 month, 3 patents applicable to steam-powered cars have already been born. Mr. Cage is also here for these patents. Because materials and tools are provided for free, many students have applied to participate, and most of the aided students have signed up. Today's event is an extreme obstacle course, testing the power car's adaptability to extreme environments, with high demands on tires, bearings, and geared transmission. With President Portland's irrepressibly excited explanation echoing in his ears, Klein looked somewhat blankly at the miniature power cars on the track, barely swallowing the words, four-wheel drive car. Mr. Mormont, may I ask who proposed this miniature power car? Maintaining his expression with the power of the clown potion, Klein asked in a curious tone. Hearing this question, President Portland immediately said, it was Viscount Panradax's. He seemed to want to invest in the power car industry but was worried about the risks, so he commissioned several power car models from our school. After they were made, he said to let a few toy cars run, and it eventually turned into this competition. They won. I knew Melissa could do it. That little girl is simply born for machine. If she doesn't join, cough cough. Mid-sentence, this typical steam worshipper suddenly realized he was losing his composure, quickly coughed twice, and explained somewhat awkwardly. That first car to arrive is the work of my apprentice. She's very talented in this area. At this point, President Portland's voice gradually faded, because he noticed that Miss Audrey and Mr. Kid's expressions were both a bit strange. Chapter 518. This clone must have been contaminated. Annie, please put this away for me. Remember to remind me to take it to the foundation tomorrow morning. Audrey, who had returned home after a busy day, handed the small box she was holding to Annie. Inside were thank you letters from the children and young people sponsored by the foundation, as well as some inexpensive but heartfelt small gifts. Understood, miss. Oh, Viscount Panradaxes sent another ball invitation. It's already in your bedroom. Besides that, he also sent Susie an invitation for pet care. Annie took the small box with both hands, then said with a slightly strange expression. Audrey's expression immediately stiffened upon hearing this, but she still nodded and said, I know, but I'm very busy these days. Let's talk about it next week. All right, I understand. Annie nodded, turned and left with the small box, while Audrey seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, turning and returning to her room. Audrey, you're back. Seeing Audrey enter the room, Susie immediately stood up. However, what made Audrey's face darken was seeing an exquisite invitation spread open in front of Susie. Susie, even though this is just an invitation, it's very bad behavior to look at it without my permission. Audrey awkwardly took 2 steps forward, picked up the invitation, and closed it without even looking at it. Susie heard Audrey's words but shook her head and said, but this invitation is for me. Mr. Paindrax invited me for grooming. Those little people's grooming is much more comfortable than other vets. Audrey took a deep breath, somewhat helplessly rubbing her forehead, unsure how to explain to Susie the strange rumors that Mr. Devil's clone's actions might cause. Starting suddenly more than a month ago, Mr. Devil's clone began to act very strangely, often causing harmless but hilarious incidents. For example, after helping Mr. Moon punish that sanguine Viscount last time, Mr. Moon acquired a strange curse where anyone who saw him would politely greet him. This was nothing in itself, but for Mr. Moon, a proud but unsociable sanguine, it was not friendly at all. There were also Zio and Furs. It was said that Mr. Devil also helped them when they investigated Viscount's fort, but in the end, Furs published 7 short stories in just 1 week. Audrey didn't think Furs would be so diligent. As for Zio, oh, poor Zio. She actually suffered the terrible curse where her shoes would disappear if she wore heels over 2 centimeters. Besides, there was also the star. Although she didn't know what happened to him, Judging from his expression during the last Tarot Club meeting when everyone was denouncing Mr. Devil's clone, he must have also suffered some kind of well-intentioned curse. Mr. Devil, please come back soon, otherwise your clone might do who knows what else. Audrey thought helplessly. Although Mr. Devil's clone hadn't brought harm to anyone and had indeed provided the help everyone needed, even assisting the Tarot Club members in overcoming their weaknesses, the methods used. Audrey felt that if it were her, she definitely wouldn't be able to accept them. It's a good thing I don't need Mr. Devil's help with anything recently. Just as Audrey's thought reached this point, her door was knocked, and then her elder brother Hilbert's voice came from the doorway. Audrey, I heard you're back. Ah, Hilbert, is something wrong? Audrey immediately got up and opened the door, only to see her brother with a strange expression, looking as if he wanted to speak but hesitated. Seeing her brother's expression, Audrey immediately secretly released a mental soothe, making Hilbert's emotions stable and peaceful, allowing him to express what he wanted to say more easily. However, she regretted it immediately afterward, because as soon as her brother spoke, it was, Audrey, did that Paindrax send you another ball invitation? On the other side, Klein, back home, tossed and turned, unable to settle down, because Mr. Devil's clone had been behaving too abnormally recently. At the end of the last Tarot Club meeting, it almost turned into a complaint session, and Magician even asked the great Mr. Fool to check if Mr. Devil's clone was really possessed by an evil spirit. In fact, he also somewhat suspected if Mr. Devil's clone was out of control, but through observation above the gray fog, he was sure that this clone had no problems, it was just, well, a bit mischievous. In fact, he was even a little pleased with the clone's behavior, but today, he couldn't sit still. Because it seemed like things had fallen on him. If it were Mr. Devil, he definitely wouldn't do anything excessive, but this clone seems to be a bit out of control. Klein was half worried and half making excuses for himself. After some mental preparation, he finally couldn't suppress the tremor in his heart and disappeared from the room. In the North District, on Piercefield Street, in a not too luxurious two-story detached house, Benson was facing a mirror, applying the sap of the Doringsman tree from the southern continent to his scalp with a complex mood. This was a very popular southern continent specialty at the moment, said to be very beneficial for hair growth. Of course, although his family was quite well off now, Benson wouldn't spend money on such things. This bottle of sap was sent by Klein's friend. He just didn't want to waste it. Just as the coolness of the sap spread across his scalp, Benson's spiritual intuition suddenly stirred. He turned his head sharply and said cautiously, "Who? Klein." The change in his voice from caution to surprise happened in an instant. Benson almost immediately lowered his voice to avoid attracting the servant's attention. It's me." Klein also saw Benson's state clearly at this time, scratched his cheek a little awkwardly, and then said, "I happen to have nothing to do, so I came to visit. How is Melissa doing recently?" "Everything is fine." Benson, for a moment, had forgotten that he was fertilizing his scalp. He excitedly took 2 steps forward, pulled Klein to sit on a chair, and said with a smile, "The bicycle shares you left appreciated very quickly, but I still retain my identity as a government employee, which helps me understand the dynamics of Backland. Melissa's grades are also very good. Her mentor is the famous Mr. Portland, who is the president of Backland Technical University. However, Melissa seems to have recently become obsessed with some kind of miniature power car. After school, she'll tinker with those things in her room. Oh, I'll go call her now. She'll definitely be very happy to know you're back." As Benson's words came out like a barrage, Klein instantly felt that the slight sense of distance he had felt after a long absence disappeared, replaced by a feeling of ease, the feeling of a traveler who had been away for years finally returning home. However, I can't stop now. Klein thought of the news about the approaching war he had just received not long ago, forcibly suppressing the laziness in his heart. However, with Melissa's surprised shout of, "Klein," his spirit softened again. Taking an occasional break isn't so bad. Chapter 519, Klein is courting death again. Klein, who hadn't returned home in a long time, rarely relaxed, but soon he returned to his busy routine. Because, not long ago, during his conversation with the servant of concealment, Ms. Ariana, he had realized that the king's plan would likely be completed very soon. Herwin Landbus's disappearance, the conjured fake ruins, and this extremely high-grade cross. Klein looked at the spiky cross that Magician and Judgment had just sacrificed to Mr. Fool, his expression slightly solemn. This cross possessed a very high grade, capable of easily purifying powers in various domains such as corruption, defilement, evil, darkness, and disease, and could even clear mental pollution within Beander characteristics. In fact, when he figured out the item's abilities, Klein's first reaction was to think of Mr. Devil's ability to purify Beander characteristics, but after actual use, he found that this item couldn't achieve the same thoroughness as Mr. Devil. This cross should already be a demigod-level item. It seems Mr. Devil's method of purifying Beander characteristics is very advanced. Klein played with the spiky cross, wanting to test its power, yet he was a little afraid of pain. After all, to unleash the item's ability, he had to draw blood with the spikes, which made him very indecisive. Finally, Klein sighed in self-consolation. This item has two severe side effects. It can only be placed above the gray fog, with little opportunity for use normally. It's a pity Mr. Devil has already prepared a demigod Beander characteristic for Little Sun, otherwise, I could consider selling it to him. Thinking of this, Klein placed the cross on the long bronze table, his eyes lost in thought, because he suddenly realized that this thing had no connection to the symbol of the eternal blazing sun church. Instead, it resembled a certain religion on earth. But if that were the case, considering its sun domain ability, this item was very likely related to the Silver City creator, the ancient sun god, the father of Aemon and Adam. And that individual was suspected by Senior Paindrax to be a transmigrator. If it truly is a relic of the ancient sun god, then its appearance in Viscount Sfort's hands likely means that the Psychology Alchemists is just a facade. Although it doesn't rule out the possibility of the Augustus family collecting it themselves, would the two sons of the creator really allow the ancient sun god's relic to flow out? But, if it was really provided by Adam, then would this item falling into my hands also be his arrangement? Klein re-examined the entire process and found everything to be very logical, but this very logic made him involuntarily recall the terror of being controlled by 008. Indeed, it's better to do a divination. Klein didn't hesitate. Although divining this item might be courting death, he still hoped to clarify the issues within it. Fortunately, he was now a demigod, and both the damage he could withstand and the power of the mysterious space above the gray fog he could mobilize far exceeded the past. This allowed him to finally make up his mind after a brief period of self-consolation. He leaned back against the chair, holding the Cross of No Darkness in one hand and a piece of paper with the divination statement in the other, repeating the divination statement in a low voice. As he repeated it again and again, Klein used his meditation state as a springboard to enter a deep dream. Passing through the hazy dream vortex, a building cast in layers of gray and white appeared at the end of his vision. The building's original shape was unrecognizable, and countless monsters seemed to hide within the dark environment. Suddenly, a crack appeared on the surface of the gray-white building, and a pale-skinned hand reached out. A figure emerged. It was a male, wearing a black clerical robe, with a silver cross hanging on his chest. The man's hair was not long, predominantly black, but the roots showed an egg yolk gold hue, and his eyes were pure gold. His skin was fair, his features deep-set, and his eye sockets sunken, bearing a strong resemblance to the people of the current northern continent. Of course, this resemblance could also be compared to Caucasians before the Transmigration. In his vision, the man suddenly took 2 steps forward, reached out and grasped the seemingly ordinary cross, his eyes gradually shedding their confused state, and a smile slowly formed on his lips. He then spoke in a deep voice. "Let there be light." In an instant, the darkness around the gray-white building was pierced by bright light, revealing its true form. This was a deep valley with no visible top, yet infinite light instantly filled every corner of it. And so, there was light in this world. The scene flashed again, and the next image appeared before Klein's eyes. A drop of blood, radiating light and heat, fell onto the silver cross. Following the blood upwards, a figure composed of pure light could be seen. His unseeable face was turned upwards, with tangible pain and distortion overflowing from him. His gaze swept over, towards above the gray fog, towards Klein sitting on the fool's high-backed chair, and the deep voice rang out again. The fool. Suddenly, Klein's thoughts exploded without warning. Just as Klein was courting death, Zhou and Furs were in a house in south of the bridge, Backland. In front of them was a beautiful lady radiating allure. Her face was slightly round, and she wore a fitted long dress, sitting on the sofa, observing the two with interest. Especially Zhou, who was wearing flat shoes. "What can I do for you?" Triss slightly shifted her gaze upwards from Zhou's already burning stare. Although she hadn't yet jumped to the hunter pathway, she felt she was becoming increasingly good at sarcasm lately. "I want to know more information." Though Zhou felt very uncomfortable under Triss's gaze, she forcibly suppressed her emotions. Viscount Sfort's spontaneous combustion had dealt her a significant blow. If Mr. Snow's vague answer back then had only given her, then at sequence 9, a few more ideas for investigation, now, having traveled no short distance on the Meander path, she had truly realized the difficulty of her goal. After understanding how many forces were contending behind her father's death, she even lost all motivation for a time, only finally regaining her spirits with Furz's comfort. Although she felt it would be more appropriate to ask Mr. Snow about this, after glancing at her feet, which could only wear flat shoes, Zhou still found this lady, who had recently gained some fame in Lowen's social circles, through certain channels. After all, if not for her and Mr. Devil's avatar fighting the demoness pathway demigod, they wouldn't have had the chance to take down Viscount Sfort. But upon hearing Zhou's words, Triss merely rubbed the ring on her index finger, her expression teasing. "Why should I tell you?" Chapter 520 Return. Why should I tell you? Hearing Triss's lazy yet playful words, Ha's expression turned a little unpleasant. However, Furs had clearly prepared for this. She reached out and patted Ha, signaling her to calm down. Then, looking at Triss, she said very seriously, "I don't know what your relationship with Mr. Snow is, but since he saved you, it means we are not enemies. And your actions against Viscount Sfort mean that we should have the same investigative direction. To avoid interfering with each other later, I think exchanging some information is a very efficient approach." "Well said, but I don't think the two of you can provide me with any useful information." Triss's gaze swept over the two, her tone clearly lacking trust. However, Furs was not impatient, her expression was calm as she said, "You can ask Mr. Snow for instructions." "Hey." Triss let out a soft chuckle but did not continue the topic. Instead, she turned her gaze to Ha. "You are the daughter of that former court earl, aren't you?" Ha's eyes immediately lit up upon hearing this. The other party saying so clearly indicated an intention to cooperate, and she immediately nodded. Triss, upon hearing this, showed no emotion on the surface, but in her heart, she was thinking about how to utilize this little one who had come knocking. Although her recent missions had been going quite smoothly, Backland was, after all, that guy's home turf. To achieve victory, besides her own good work, she also needed some unconventional tactics. Of course, because of a certain person, she dared not cause destruction. Since that was the case, she could only seek another approach, such as, doing the other party's work as well. According to that guy, the purpose of this plan was to establish connections with both the military and political circles, and then, through loopholes in the contract, achieve the theft of the nation. If that was the case, if she seized a larger share, would she not be able to affect the other party's mission progress without affecting the overall plan? HMPH, I'm definitely going to be this prince. Triss's face revealed a sinister smile, and then she looked at Ha, saying in a suggestive tone, "If you want to know more truth, merely being an outsider of military intelligence section 9 won't cut it. Are you interested in becoming an official member of military intelligence section 9? Unshadowed and Justice Mentor are sequence 4 and sequence 3 of the Sun Pathway. Then this Black Knight and Trinity Templar." Above the gray fog, Klein, who had finally recovered from the shock of his near-death experience, copied the knowledge he had spied. In that previous glance, he had obtained 4 high-sequence Meander potion formulas. The first 2 were clearly identifiable by their pathway, but the latter 2, he was momentarily at a loss. However, a moment later, he recalled the Aurora Order's saint he had encountered in the ruins of the God War before. His evil side was a knight in black armor wielding a greatsword. If Black Knight is sequence 4 of the secret supplicant pathway, then Ancient Sun God is indeed a true god of both the Sun and Hanged Man pathways. Or even more. Sequence 0 is achieved by consuming 3 sequence 1 characteristics and a uniqueness of the same pathway. Is it possible to further advance by consuming the true God characteristics of neighboring pathways? Just like in the City of Silver's creation myth, ancient sun god recovered the authority of the ancient gods, and the objects of his recovery happened to be the dragon and elf races of neighboring pathways. Klein secretly noted down his conjectures, suddenly realizing the true meaning of the words Rosal once wrote in his diary. Once you choose a sequence, your friends and enemies are already determined. So it was hinting at beyond sequence 0. No wonder the 3 great churches of Storm, Sun, and Knowledge are mortal enemies and extremely hostile towards the Aurora Order, and Rosal also said that the Sunset Otaku group is extremely hostile towards True Creator. As the information he possessed increased, Klein gradually realized that many seemingly casual conversations in the past contained a great deal of information. Forget it, I won't think about this. For now, my attention is still on the King and Adam's schemes. Klein rubbed his forehead in distress, preparing to return to reality. Just as he had begun to enter a state of meditation, a series of overlapping prayers suddenly sounded. Klein's movements instantly stiffened, because he saw that the deep red star belonging to Mr. Devil had finally begun to flicker again. The fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who controls good luck, I pray for your listening, I pray for your gaze. I have returned from the forsaken land of the gods and can participate in the next tarot club. After completing his prayer, Snow ordered the Black Pearl to patrol near the ruins of the God War, then opened the traveler's door. However, at this moment, a distant and profound sound suddenly echoed in his ears. I know. Listening to the layered response in his ears, Snow's lips curled slightly. Although he was somewhat surprised by Klein's instant reply, Mr. Fool's voice was truly kind. After all, in these past few months, apart from meeting True Creator, he had only heard the voices of Irene, Lily, and Heaven Manufacturing. Now, whatever he heard felt very kind. First, I'll go to Black Swan Castle for a good meal, then go to Intis to properly place the Town Church Divine Artifact, and then I can return to Backland. I hope the split soul hasn't caused any trouble. The main body is back. In Backland, the Snow clone, who was reviewing the Enthusiasm expansion plan, suddenly looked up, a look of relief on his face. However, upon realizing that the other party had no intention of immediately returning to Backland, the clone's face instantly fell. Based on his understanding of the main body, if the other party intended to return, they would immediately come back through the teleportation door after re-establishing the connection. Since he hadn't returned yet, it meant he wasn't planning to return immediately in the short term, at least not in the next 2 days. I thought I could rest. Forget it, at least I can see the holiday now. The clone took a deep breath, lowered his head again, and began to draw on the documents. Expanding enthusiasm throughout Loan was no simple task. It required not only a certain understanding of the conditions in various major cities but also fine-tuning based on the local class structure and wealth disparity. Even though the workers' movement had already spread out more than half a year ago, the workers' movement in various places were not all united. Those who had experienced the Backland strike with lavish were fine, but among those who joined later, there were inevitably some who profited under the guise of the workers' movement. Identifying these parasites, maintaining the purity of the team, balancing the rights of the workers' movement and enthusiasm, and how to assign the personnel dispatched by Military Intelligence Section 9, these were all things he needed to do. Could it be that the main body ran off at this time precisely because he was too lazy to deal with these troublesome issues? Chapter 521, The Eternal God's Chosen One Needs to Hurry. In Trier, the nave of the Church of Light, 27 priests in cassocks surrounded the altar, their faces solemn as they looked at the altar. Several months had passed, and the Holy Light Cathedral had completely transformed. All the previously smoke-blackened sections had been replaced, and the stained glass mosaics had all been replaced with religious stories from the Church of Light. The abstract sun holy emblem, symbolizing the eternal blazing sun, which was originally at the top of the cathedral, was long gone, replaced by a giant cross. If there was any flaw, it was that the position in the altar, where the symbol of a deity should have been placed, had always been empty. And now, Snow was placing a faint golden cross on the altar. As it was fixed there, Snow reached out and tapped his chest 4 times. However, this time, what he performed was not the Aurora Order's inverted cross up, down, right, left but the upright cross up, down, left, right. The Lord who created all, the true reflection of the fallen self, the bearer of all suffering, I pray for your listening, I pray for your gaze, I pray for you, to bestow your divine grace. As Snow chanted, the surrounding priests also made praying gestures. These divine envoys and saints, gathered from all over the world, began to pray almost in perfect synchronization. Voices, some young, some old, some clear, some hoarse, merged into one, spreading out with each wave of prayer. In various parts of Trier, people subtly began to pray. As the prayers converged, the golden cross on the altar glowed with a dazzling white light, like metal being gradually heated. The light grew brighter and brighter, and as this happened, the members of the Church of Light could clearly feel a gaze piercing through space and descending upon them. The cross now seemed to be entirely forged from light, and with the projection of that gaze, a black human figure slowly appeared in the center of the light. It had no face, no form, as if composed of an illusory shadow. It slowly sank into the cross constructed of light, much like slowly submerging into water. The light was no longer so scorching, and the gaze began to slowly recede. The originally golden cross turned into a metallic white, not silver white, but a peculiar light gold. When the believers focused their attention on it, the feeling of being watched by a deity, of establishing a connection with a deity, brought an immense sense of security to the former Aurora Order saints and divine envoys. Snow did not forge the remnant divinity of the eternal blazing sun into a weapon but used it as a medium, entrusting it to the true Creator. Through this medium, and with the true Creator's power, the light originally belonging to the ancient sun god, which Snow had collected from the ruins of the divine war, was refined and condensed. Then, with the help of Bonava, an artisan of the machinery church, it was forged into this holy artifact, capable of accommodating a portion of the true Creator's consciousness projection. As the believers continuously prayed, the light within the cross and the true Creator's consciousness would grow stronger. Once it reached a certain critical point, it could even transform into a giant of light, allowing the true Creator's consciousness to descend. Although it couldn't compare to the eraser angel of the night church, its advantage lay in the low cost of divine descent. It could be said that once this holy artifact was formed, the Church of Light would be one of only two churches, the other being the night church with its eraser angel that could use divine descent as a regular combat strength. True Creator murmur. Inside heaven manufacturing, whispers of approval continuously emerged. As prayers from various parts of Trier converged, the true Creator's consciousness became increasingly clear. As the consciousness within the cross gradually stabilized, a piano crafted from a barred characteristic was brought to the side of the altar. Snow sat at the piano, pressing the keys with force, and a series of notes rang out. With the familiar melody, the saints and divine envoys wore solemn expressions, and soon, a solemn and majestic song emanated from within the cathedral. In a mission bathed in blood, defending the land, people in the night, will greet the rising sun. Quote. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. The tide-like red light slowly receded, and Snow heard Miss Justice's familiar greeting again. Having just presided over a mass for the Church of Light in the morning, and still having to rush to the Tarot Club in the afternoon, Snow suddenly began to wonder if he had scheduled his day too tightly. It's a good thing my white horse is not horse doesn't have a meeting function, otherwise I can't imagine how busy I'd be. Snow secretly rejoiced, then bowed to Mr. Fool along with his Tarot Club companions. It's just, why is everyone looking at me so strangely? Noticing the gazes that held resentment mixed with relief, relief mixed with awkwardness, awkwardness mixed with embarrassment, and embarrassment mixed with hysteria, Snow suddenly felt that he had been a bit hasty. I should have gone back to Backland to check first. As this thought flashed through his mind, Snow was about to say something when he noticed the bronze-green cross by Mr. Fool's hand, and his brow slightly arched. Why is this thing here? Russian priest still doesn't believe I can succeed. That's right, after all, that guy only has divinity. Even if he thinks I can succeed, he'll still make arrangements with Mr. Fool. Snow sighed helplessly but didn't think much further. Even if Adam hedged his bets, it wouldn't affect the final outcome. At least he had already offered the blood. Even if he broke his promise in the end and didn't give me the author characteristic, I still have other backup plans, although I really don't want to consume the Hand of God characteristic, besides Snow, everyone else had clearly noticed the cross. After a round of internal deliberation, Catlia suddenly closed her eyes, making a rather significant movement. Mr. Fool saw this and immediately chuckled, saying, "Don't worry, this manifested pair of glasses conceal your eye of scrutiny." Catlia, who had voluntarily sealed her eye of scrutiny, breathed a sigh of relief and respectfully said, "Great Mr. Fool, this time there is a page of Rosal's diary." Rosal's diary. Is Queen Mystic done with her business? What a coincidence. Did she and Mr. Devil go to the forsaken land of the gods together? Klein had a very deep impression of Mr. Devil and Queen Mystic having a full Manchu Han banquet on Catlia's ship, so it was hard not to associate it with this possibility. Mr. Fool, I also recorded a copy of Rosal's diary. Snow's subsequent words interrupted Klein's thoughts. He didn't think much and immediately responded. Very good, you may state your questions or requests. Just as the two began to manifest the diary, and some observant and thoughtful individuals had already realized the birth of the third demigod in the Tarot Club, Miss Hermit suddenly spoke. Respected Mr. Fool, can this time's question be accumulated for next time? Catlia made an unprecedented request, which made Klein somewhat concerned, but to maintain the image of the fool, he didn't ask further and nodded gently. You may. Mr. Fool, I will also accumulate my contribution. After agreeing to Mr. Devil's identical request, 2 pages of the diary quickly appeared in his hand. Klein casually leaned back, as usual, starting to read from Rosal's diary. With just a glance, Klein's movements stiffened, because he saw a conclusion that, although he had already guessed, still made his hair stand on end. Making the development of the era conform to one's own expectations is the visionary's ritual for becoming a god. Indeed, the direction of this era is guided by Adam. Adam, is he also a transmigrator? Chapter 522 Pollution and Planning. A single page of the diary caused a storm of knowledge-level information to assault Klein's mind. Although Senior Paindrax's diary repeatedly made assumptions, when these conjectures were truly confirmed, Klein still felt dizzy. Were the ancient sun god and Adam both transmigrators? Or did Adam merely learn the history of his hometown from the ancient sun god and use it as a foundation to create his ritual to become a god? Regardless, George III's secret was likely his advancement to Black Emperor, and the future this might lead to was perhaps what Adam needed, or even something he actively promoted. In other words, once the tide of the era was stirred, 2 true gods would continuously be born. The Black Emperor and the Visionary. In truth, Klein himself didn't care who became a god, but judging from the Great Smog event, he couldn't help but worry about the unscrupulous methods these two displayed in their pursuit of godhood. If the future era envisioned by Adam truly was a replication of modern history before the Transmigration, as Senior Paindrax predicted, then what would follow would be 2 world wars sweeping across the entire continent. Although he wasn't very familiar with this period of history, the famous battles he had seen in history textbooks alone were enough to give him a clear impression of the brutality of war. Compared to a true world war, the casualties from Backland's Great Smog could only be considered an accident, and he absolutely could not allow such a thing to happen. Here were the people he cared about, the peace he longed for, and the home he wanted to return to. HMPH, Klein adjusted his emotions, moved the parchment with Russell's diary entries down, and then looked at Paindrax's diary, attempting to adjust his mood with the senior's gossip. Unexpectedly, what met his eyes was an unforeseen piece of news. Open black lens bracket. Oh, God Almighty, Rosal, how dare you build your grave in such a godforsaken place? All right, I finally completely understand the reason for your corruption in your later years. Thankfully, there isn't a group of high-level existences from the Savant pathway on this primitive island, nor is there a secret organization composed of savants on the continent. Should Bernadette be glad she doesn't have a bunch of younger brothers? It seems Rosal's luck is a bit better than the god of Bound, close black lens bracket. What does this mean? Did Senior Paindrax find the hidden mausoleum of Emperor Rosal when he advanced to Black Emperor? And this mausoleum seems to be related to the corruption Emperor Rosal suffered. Klein frowned, his gaze fixed on the phrase, God of Bound. He suddenly made a connection, because he remembered very clearly that in Byam, he was once attacked by an abomination, the leader of the Rose School of Thought, who claimed to be the child of the God of Bound. And thinking of the Rose School of Thought, He couldn't help but recall the phrase, "I want to bear your child," that he heard when he was acting as a stand for that general in Byam back then. Could it be that the god of bound isn't a disguise for the mother tree of desire, but was captured by the mother tree of desire? This would also explain why the temperance faction of the Rose school of thought was persecuted, because the original boss has been kidnapped by an evil god who advocates indulgence. What a grand scheme of holding the Son of Heaven hostage to command the feudal lords. And this one even gave birth to a crown prince. If all these conjectures are true, then the meaning of Senior Paindrax's words is not difficult to understand. The primitive island that Rosal and the four knights of the apocalypse landed on in his early years likely had the corruption of the mother tree of desire or a similar existence. Rosal was subtly corrupted, his temperament changed drastically in his later years, and realizing he was corrupted, he planned to wash away the corruption by jumping to the Black Emperor pathway. But under the influence of the corruption, he chose that island to establish his final mausoleum. The blasphemy slate should also have been made under the influence of the corruption, at least the moon card and mother card, which Senior Paindrax specifically emphasized, should. Wait a minute, why would it be moon and mother? Klein suddenly remembered something that the counselor of the Fate Council in the Life School of Thought had mentioned earlier. The mother tree of desire and the primordial moon are opposed to each other, with irreconcilable contradictions and subtle connections. Furthermore, to the seven orthodox deities, the primordial moon and the mother tree of desire are even more detestable. So, the one who corrupted Emperor Rosal might be the primordial moon. Student Moon also said that sanguine who pray to the primordial moon often fall into madness, becoming monsters who only know how to mate and reproduce. This also aligns with Senior Paindrax's statement of a bunch of younger brothers. Klein's demigod-level multi-threaded brain circuits quickly organized the emerging thoughts, silently noting down this information, intending to use it as a bargaining chip in future dealings with Queen Mystic. Immediately, his gaze continued to sweep down the diary. Open black lens bracket. After a preliminary understanding of this island, I immediately chose to leave. Although Rosal's seal on himself was quite stable, I was very worried that I would attract the attention of that one. However, judging from my own state, Rosal was definitely not corrupted just by setting foot on this island. He must have done something else superfluous. Close black lens bracket. Something superfluous. Klein recalled the censored content in Senior Paindrax's messages and eagerly continued to read. Open black lens bracket. The first Rosal salvage plan ended in failure. This made me realize the importance of strength. But the problem is, this level of corruption is no longer something strength can solve, unless the God paradox plan can be completed. Close black lens bracket. Open black lens bracket. It's a pity, the time point I transmigrated to is really a bit awkward. If it had been a few decades earlier, cooperating with Rosal might have been easier, but now, with the resources at hand, it's really too difficult. Close black lens bracket. Open black lens bracket. Perhaps I should slowly lie low and use the era's trend of that author to leverage resources. Oh, God Almighty, I was a struggling writer in my previous life. Asking me to engage in such schemes of nation building and usurpation, my expertise doesn't match. Close black lens bracket. God paradox. What exactly is this plan? Klein had seen this term more than once in Senior Paindrax's diary. Even Queen Mystic seemed very interested in paradox, but besides the fact that this plan likely involved a true god, Klein had no clue whatsoever. However, it now seemed that the resources required for this plan were probably enormous, and it would only be possible with the support of a nation. But thinking about it carefully, in a sense, Mr. Devil had already taken over Intis. Did this mean that he was about to launch the God Paradox plan? If that was truly the case, then was Mr. Devil's joining Military Intelligence Section 9 also related to this plan? Klein sighed inwardly, his gaze falling to the end of the diary, where there was a brief statement. Open black lens bracket. Later generations who can understand my diary, if the Paindrax family has become royalty when you transmigrate, then please be very careful, because they have likely already been corrupted. Close black lens bracket. Don't worry, your family now only has one sole heir left. Klein internally grumbled, waved his hand to disperse the parchment, his gaze sweeping over both sides of the bronze long table, and finally said in a leisurely tone. You may begin. Chapter 523, The Evil Done by the Avatar. Snow had expected Miss Justice to inquire about the cross, but unexpectedly, almost at the same time Mr. Fool's voice fell, several gazes landed on him simultaneously. At the same time, Miss Justice, who had always been curious about the items that appeared before Mr. Fool, surprisingly asked, "Mr. Devil, have you returned from the forsaken land of the gods?" Yes, I just left a couple of days ago. I'm currently handling some matters in Intis and will be back in Backland in 2 days at most. Is there something you need?" Snow asked in as calm a voice as possible. Unexpectedly, as soon as he spoke, Little Moon immediately said, Can you remove that strange curse on me? Mine needs to be removed too. I'm already sequence 6, and with just one more mission, our debt will be cleared." Miss Magician, seeing someone else speak first, immediately raised her hand and said. Snow raised an eyebrow. Before he could even ask what kind of curse it was, Miss Judgment also weakly said, "Mine too." And as Miss Judgment spoke, Mr. the Star also placed one hand on his chest and said in an incredibly exaggerated tone, "Oh, and mine too. This is truly a troublesome curse. So what exactly are you all cursed with?" Snow's expression grew increasingly subtle. Although he suspected this matter was probably related to his clone, if he thought about it carefully, even his most mischievous clone wouldn't curse members of the Tarot Club. "Anyone who sees me will actively come over to say hello. I have to write a short story every day, or my conscience will ache. I can't wear shoes with heels more than 2 centimeters high." As the three reported their curses, the Star suddenly choked up. After holding it in for a long time, he said, blushing, "Speaking, it must be in poetry. Quote. 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 The Tarot Club fell into a moment of silence. Then everyone realized that Mr. Poet's strange tone in previous Tarot Club meetings was him composing poetry. But why did it just sound like normal conversations with strange interjections and inexplicably broken sentences? "All right, I understand. This isn't a curse." Snow sighed, roughly understanding what was happening, and said helplessly, "The specific principle isn't convenient to explain. In short, it's an ability that enhances resistance by making people confront their own weaknesses. Never mind its specific effects for now. How exactly can this be removed?" "I'm almost driven mad," Little Moon asked directly, not caring if it was an ability or a mystical item. Snow shook his head and said, "As I said before, there's a reason you were given this ability. This is an ability that occupies a slot. Its most important characteristic is first come, first served. That is to say, after being affected by this ability, your spirit will enter a state of high resistance. In this state, you will no longer be affected by other mental interference abilities. Of course, even the strongest ability has its limits. If a king of angels deliberately targets you, it probably won't last for more than a few days. But its disappearance also serves as a warning. It tells you that you have been affected by some high-level mental ability. I think the reason my clone used this ability on you is probably that a high-sequence Beander from the spectator pathway has appeared near you. As for how to remove it, it's actually very simple. As long as you wholeheartedly stop resisting this power, it will automatically disappear after 1 day." This was the truth. The ability applied to the 4 was a variant of hard white same different. Its effect, as he described, was to highlight mental weaknesses, thereby emphasizing a state of mental resistance, to gain more lasting mental resilience. It was not essentially a curse, but a blessing, so even Mr. Fool, who did not know the truth, could not easily purify it. But there was one thing Snow concealed: this ability did not necessarily have to reverse weaknesses. As long as it could put a person in a state of mental discomfort, even just being startled by a bug, it could trigger this ability. The current problem clearly arose because his clone wanted to have fun. Of course, he wouldn't mention such a problem that would affect the reputation of his Tarot Club. Hearing Snow's explanation, the 4 who were cursed immediately felt complicated. After all, both Herwin Landbus and the King of Angels, whose name could not be spoken, were currently active in Backland. It was understandable for that clone to act this way to protect them. As for why it wasn't explicitly stated. After all, they were high-sequence Beyonders of the spectator pathway. Mind reading, suggestion, and memory alteration were all effortless for them. A slight mistake could lead to huge trouble. What if we can't accept it? Furs said with a complex expression. Snow glanced at the slacker, shaking his head meaningfully. Then you'll just have to wait until I return to Backland. The Tarot Club fell into a brief silence. It seemed that with Mr. Devil's explanation, the members of the Tarot Club had all fallen into a state of desirelessness for a moment. Fortunately, Miss Justice was a very sensitive spectator. She immediately noticed this, sage time. After a moment of thought, she abandoned the idea of asking Mr. Snow to return and deal with that foolish clone who only sent the ball invitation to her. Instead, she focused her attention on the cross. Respected Mr. Fool, does that cross by your hand have any special significance? If the answer requires an equivalent exchange, you can directly state your request. Klein was quite pleased with Miss Justice's rescue. He immediately smiled and looked at Miss Justice, saying, "This question is nothing. It is a relic of the ancient eternal blazing sun." Miss Magician Furz's eyes immediately widened, seemingly unable to believe the answer she heard. Mr. Fool, however, casually glanced at Mr. Devil out of the corner of his eye. Its level isn't too high, it only corresponds to the unshadowed. Its greatest use is to clear mental pollution within Deander characteristics, help those who have consumed too many potions extract excess characteristics, and allow those unwilling to stay in the mysterious world to return to normalcy. While saying this, Klein kept an eye on Snow's changes, but to his surprise, Mr. Devil's face actually showed an expression of interest. He had expected him to be as calm as usual, or perhaps show surprise or astonishment, but he hadn't expected it to be interest. Why is he interested? As someone who killed the manifestation of the eternal blazing sun, he shouldn't be lacking unshadowed characteristics. And Mr. Devil doesn't seem like someone who would care about its symbolic meaning. Could this cross have some other meaning? Klein felt a slight unease in his heart. While he stated that the cross could be exchanged or rented for a sufficient price, he considered whether to have the puppet world investigate. Chapter 524 Communication. After a round of exchanging formulas and intelligence, Klein suddenly made the world sit up straight, looked at the star, and asked, "Help me ask if that person has seen the second blasphemy slate." As soon as these words were spoken, the members of the Tarot Club fell into a brief daze. Even Little Sun, through such a long period of communication, understood the significance of the second blasphemy slate. For a moment, in the eyes of the Tarot Club members, the comedic Mr. Snow, who seemed to have joined the group by clinging to Mr. World's coattails, also appeared profound and unfathomable. Mr. Snow did not know about his companion's impolite thoughts at the moment. He was silent for a moment before speaking in a somewhat strange tone. "All right." As soon as this word left his mouth, that profound image immediately collapsed. The Tarot Club members instantly confirmed that even if he knew a powerful figure who had seen the blasphemy slate, he himself was still a comedian. To prevent his old classmate's image from further collapsing, Mr. World looked around and then brought up another matter. The Night Church received intelligence from Major General Chunis Kolb, Deputy Director of Military Intelligence Section 9, confirming that George III, the King of Loan, harbors a secret. He secretly sent people to excavate the Blood Emperor's ruins and colluded with the demonist sect and the psychology alchemists. However, the three great churches have not yet gathered enough evidence. With Herwin Landbus's disappearance, the matter seemingly subsided. There is reason to suspect that there might be traitors among the high-ranking officials of the three great churches. Klein manipulated the dummy, describing the intelligence he had previously obtained in a very detailed manner, but this directly led everyone to involuntarily look at Snow. Especially the old members of the Tarot Club, they remembered very clearly that since a long time ago, this Mr. Devil had been investigating the demonist sect and the psychology alchemists, and Hugh knew even more clearly that he had a deep understanding of his father's affairs. Noticing everyone's gazes, Snow roughly estimated the time, feeling that he could reveal some issues, so he spoke. "George III is an archangel." "What? That's impossible." Alger's eyes widened, but he quickly noticed his lapse and suppressed the nature of the folk of rage, speaking as calmly as possible. "There is a rule among the Orthodox churches that the kings of the major kingdoms on the continent must never advance to a high sequence. This is not to restrict royal power, but because becoming a demigod often grants a long lifespan, which has a very negative impact on the church's concealment of Deander existences. Therefore, if a king wants to advance to a demigod, he must first abdicate. Moreover, kings are regularly inspected by the church. Even if a church's archbishop cannot see through an angel, he should have been discovered when he advanced to a demigod. What if an angel of the spectator pathway concealed him? Snow's tone was calm, but the atmosphere of the tarot club instantly fell silent. Everyone's mood immediately became complicated. In fact, Mr. Devil's words also revealed another issue. For an archangel to still need to keep a secret under the watchful eyes of the three great churches, it could only be that, couldn't it? A moment later, Audrey finally took the initiative to break the brief silence, speaking up. I will keep an eye out for Herwin Landbus's whereabouts. Upon seeing Miss Justice speak, Judgment immediately said, I've also been investigating related matters recently. If there's anything you need my cooperation with, please don't hesitate. I've already formed a partnership with a defector from the demonist sect. She tacitly did not question Mr. Devil, because based on Mr. Devil's previous attendance at the gathering, everyone understood that this gentleman bore many contracts, and even with Mr. Fool's protection at the Tarot Club, he might still suffer contractual punishment upon returning to reality. Snow expressed great satisfaction with his companion's understanding, while Klein controlled the world to remind them. Whether you are looking for Herwin Landbus's whereabouts or investigating the king's secret, pay attention to whether there are too many coincidences in the things around you. If there are, please inform me immediately. Seeing everyone begin to ponder the chill of coincidences, Little Sun, who had been blindly observing, finally couldn't hold back and spoke. After a period of adjustment and preparation, I will follow the exploration team to the afternoon town camp. This time, we will likely try to enter the giant court, Mr. Devil. You have just returned from the forsaken land of the gods. Do you have any suggestions? Also, may I know what you discovered in the forsaken land of the gods? There were some discoveries. Snow pondered for a moment, then said in a somewhat solemn tone. My trip to the forsaken land of the gods this time was because, while deciphering some secret documents left by my ancestors, I discovered traces of the first blasphemy slate. The first blasphemy slate. It was already astonishing that Mr. the Star knew someone who had seen the second blasphemy slate, but now Mr. Devil actually said that he had discovered traces of the first blasphemy slate. Mr. Devil, did you find that slate? Miss Justice asked curiously, silently praying that it must have been found. After all, that was the slate that recorded 22 divine pathways. As long as it was obtained, the Tarot Club would no longer lack Beander potion formulas. I found it, but I didn't get it. Snow sighed. The first blasphemy slate is in the giant court, but when I found it, I discovered that not only was there terrible pollution, but it was also being watched by the true creator and three kings of angels whose names cannot be mentioned. Once that door is rashly opened, it might attract their attention. Although Mr. Devil spoke of three kings of angels, the companions who had participated in the previous discussion about the kings of angels all understood that this referred to the three true gods: Eternal Blazing Sun, Lord of Storms, and God of Knowledge and Wisdom. But, even three true gods were only watching. Because that is the true creator's sanctuary. Alger had a certain guess in his heart and asked it aloud. Snow nodded and said, the true creator and the three former kings of angels should be in some kind of stalemate. I think behind that door, there might not only be the blasphemy slate, but also something that the three former kings of angels and the true creator all want to obtain. However, because these four are mortal enemies, they restrain each other. Once this state is broken, I'm afraid a divine war will break out again in the forsaken land of the gods. Divine war. Derek's eyes showed a hint of fear. With the City of Silver currently only having a sequence 4 as its strongest, it simply could not withstand the aftermath of a divine war. His heart suddenly grew anxious. He must lead the City of Silver out of the forsaken land of the gods before such a situation came to pass. Don't be too eager, that makes it easier to make mistakes instead. The Hanged Man's voice interrupted Little Sun's thoughts. Derek looked at the trustworthy Mr. Hanged Man with a slightly bewildered expression, then heard him explain. Those four have been in a stalemate for who knows how many years. This stalemate is not that easy to break, unless a trustworthy true god is added to their camp, but that is clearly not easy. What you need to do next is not to do anything extra. Follow your chief's arrangements, pray to Mr. Fool as much as possible, and if you encounter difficulties, you can apply for a small-scale discussion, like Moon. Chapter 525, the Church of Light is developing. Back in reality, Snow lifted the spiritual blockade on the room, put the heaven manufacturing back around his neck, and took out a small dried fish to give to Lily, who was routinely guarding the door. Although she could now make dried fish herself, Lily still loved the reward she got after guarding the door. Snow picked Lily up and placed her on his shoulder, then pushed open the door and looked at the completely new Trier, a little lost in thought. Although less than 3 months had passed, the appearance of Trier had completely changed. The power of capital was strictly limited, and the status of workers had improved. Although this situation would undoubtedly collapse in any other country in a short time, Intis was an exception at this moment. Because the rulers of this country were a group composed of idealists and believers. Believers were loyal to the Creator, and idealists were loyal to their faith. They pursued not profit or power, but something on another level. In the current Intis, common people could live like human beings, and high-ranking officials could receive rewards commensurate with their efforts. No one would take a single hair, and no one would take a single cent. In Snow's view, this was already the most perfect social structure. Although Snow knew very well that such a system could not last too long, because human desires could never truly disappear. It would be difficult for the next generation to maintain such idealism and devout faith, and it was even a question how long this generation could maintain their current mindset. But this actually didn't matter. After all, this world was less than 20 years away from the apocalypse. As for whether they could survive the apocalypse after 20 years, and what would become of this country after the apocalypse, that was something the citizens of this country needed to explore. Everyone has divinity, everyone is born equal. In the eyes of the Creator, we are all the same. No one is nobler than anyone else, only their positions are different. The Lord's love for all people is the same. The reason some people hold high positions is simply because the responsibilities they bear are different. In the square, a priest of the Church of Light was preaching to the believers. Many people could be seen listening carefully. Although it was unknown how many of them were there for the eggs they could receive after the sermon, as long as they remembered a sentence or two, it could serve as an anchor for the true Creator. In comparison, 1 or 2 eggs were not a big deal. Snow stood on the edge of the square and listened for a while, jotting down some inappropriate parts of the sermon, or rather, parts that would be difficult for the public to believe, intending to pass them on to Mr. A later for revision. He was not in a hurry to return to Backland. Although he already knew that his clone had caused trouble, judging from the state of the Tarot Club members, the clone had acted with some discretion. Instead of rushing back to clean up the mess now, it was better to first deal with Intis, this main base. Currently, all 22 divine envoys and 7 saints of the Aurora Order, including the protagonist. Additionally, there is a new Mr. A now, but Saint of Light Mr. has no name, so he is still called Mr. A, had come to Intis. Besides the placement of the holy relics and the first official mass, the main purpose was to preach. The reason they waited more than 2 months before preparing to preach in the countryside was mainly out of concern for the Eternal Blazing Sun Church. Although it had the steam and machinery church within and the Church of Knowledge and Wisdom without, the Eternal Blazing Sun Church was still a behemoth. While it only had 2 angels, the number of saints far exceeded that of the Church of Light. Although the Church of Light possessed the strongest shepherd among the mid-sequence, not every divine envoy was a sequence 5, nor could every divine envoy be fully equipped. But now, everything was different. With the successful placement of the holy relic created by Snow and Bonneva, the Church of Light had a new trump card. The Holy Light Cross's regular divine descent ultimate move was secondary. Its true core function was the ordination system that Snow had embedded within it. With this system, the true Creator's consciousness within the Holy Light Cross could lend power to the divine envoys, just as Snow provided spell support to the Paradox believers, directly using the divine spells bestowed by the true Creator, and even a youth version of divine descent in critical moments. In this way, even if these mid-sequence divine envoys encountered an attack from a saint of the Eternal Blazing Sun Church, they would be able to gain the power to resist him. Although they would inevitably need bed rest afterward, they would at least have their lives guaranteed. Thus, the mid-sequence of the Church of Light could be used as demigods, and demigods could be used as angels. Only then did Snow dare to let them preach throughout Intis, where cultists were rampant in various places. After touring the various squares in Intis, Snow came to the office of the Holy Light Cathedral's Archbishop and found Mr. A, who was processing documents. As a representative of the Trier Commune Conference, besides his church duties, he also needed to handle some simple state affairs. Fortunately, as the initiator and leader of the Intis workers' movement, he had accumulated some experience in this area, so he wasn't completely clueless. Although it sounded somewhat unpleasant that Mr. A newcomer, became the Archbishop of the main cathedral, in reality, none of the Aurora Order's saints had any objections. Not only because he had led a team to conquer Intis, but more importantly, compared to staying put, the saints, who had engaged in underground activities their entire lives, were more accustomed to preaching outside. Guarding the great cathedral in Trier, how could that better demonstrate the Lord's majesty than slaying heretics and deviants outside? Well, actually, the position of Archbishop was given to whoever was the weakest. Seeing Snow's arrival, Mr. A immediately put down the documents in his hand. The two were old partners, so after a brief exchange of pleasantries, they immediately got down to business. Snow pulled out the notebook containing the notes he had taken earlier from his In My Arms and handed it to Mr. A, then said, "Preaching should not be too aggressive. It's unrealistic to expect common people to immediately adapt to our doctrines. It's like giving a beggar a steamed bun, he will be grateful. But if you give him thousands of gold coins at once, he will probably start to be afraid. Compared to achieving it in one step, gradual change is the reasonable approach." Mr. A looked at the contents of the notebook item by item, cross-referencing them with his experience during this period, and then nodded, saying, "I understand. After all, we used to preach under the shadow of the Orthodox churches. Now that resources are open, it's normal for everyone to be eager for quick success. That's the truth. Actually, in terms of preaching, we can start with the Lord's honorific name. Although the Machinery Church and the Church of Knowledge and Wisdom have tacitly acknowledged our existence, the reputation of the Aurora Order and the Lord is still not very good. So we cannot directly proclaim the Lord's name in the short term, but we can establish an understanding of the Lord in the hearts of common people by explaining his honorific name. For example, use, everyone has divinity, to interpret, the creator of all things, use, everyone has desires, but they must be restrained by morality and law, to interpret, the true reflection of fallen self-nature, and use, the Lord is with everyone, to interpret, the bearer of all sentient beings suffering. Of course, this is just an example. How to explain it specifically still requires some time to explore." Mr. A nodded, indicating his understanding. Just as he was about to discuss the interpretation of the honorific name, the entire room suddenly grew cold. Then, a gray-green light flashed, and an envelope with an exquisite wax seal fell into Snow's hand. Chapter 526, The Situation in Lowen. Returning to his room, Snow tore open the beautifully sealed envelope and took out the letter inside. "Dear Mr. Crown, during my mission in Backland, I attracted the attention of the pale saintess Katrina and had some conflicts. Thanks to the avatar you left behind, I was able to retreat safely, but I can feel that she has already set her eyes on me. I must admit that my own strength is not enough to deal with her. If possible, I hope to receive your help. Sincerely, Beauty. Quote. Tisk, Triss isn't being honest." Snow shook the letter in his hand, turning it into a handful of ashes, a slight curl on his lips. He knew very well that Triss's appearance would attract Katrina's attention, but he still sent Triss out because he was certain Katrina wouldn't do anything. Because Triss herself isn't important, what's important is the primordial demoness's ring, and that ring had already been retrieved by the demoness sect during the Great Smog of Backland. Now, the demoness sect and Zhou III are in a cooperative relationship. After meeting Triss, Katrina would definitely attack first to test the waters, but once this hurdle is passed, Katrina would know that Triss is now Snow's subordinate and naturally wouldn't act rashly, at least not before her cooperation with Zhou III ends. After all, Snow's feat of single-handedly fighting the Eternal Blazing Sun's divine descent avatar is no secret in high-level circles. Katrina, a Sequence 3 known for her cautiousness, would have to consider the consequences if she wanted to target Triss. The fact that Triss wrote this letter now is to put Katrina on edge. Well, perhaps there's also a hint of wanting to show off her progress. My reputation in Backland is already enough to attract Katrina's attention, that's probably the feeling. Shaking his head slightly, Snow was not in a hurry to reply. In fact, he was very satisfied with Triss's sense of crisis. After all, with Katrina chasing her, Triss would be more eager to aim for the position of a demigod. The rivalry between Adelina and her for the male and female roles was, in the end, just a provocation from Snow. Facing a choice between two Byander characteristics, if both could resist making a choice, then this conflict would naturally be resolved. But when one party urgently wants to advance, this internal competition cycle will truly begin to turn. In the Backland Bridge district, within a gloomy alley. Wearing flat shoes, Zio vigilantly looked left and right, wondering if something had gone wrong with that demoness lady. Not bad, getting more experienced. As a low male voice sounded, a figure emerged from the darkness of the corner. Looking at this man with a golden mask, who appeared taller and more upright than usual, Zio couldn't help but feel a hint of resentment. "What do you need to emergency contact me for?" Zio proactively asked, ready to pray to Mr. Fool at any moment. However, the golden masked man showed no hostility, merely stating calmly, "Frankly, I didn't expect you to find such a channel. I don't know what you're talking about." Zio frowned, her back tensing slightly, suddenly feeling fortunate that she was wearing flat shoes today, which were more suitable for escape. "No need to doubt, I know your background very well." The golden masked man took a deep breath and shook his head gently. "Actually, you don't need to seek the truth. I know this is what drives you to persist in missions related to Viscount Stratford, but my personal advice is to let go of these matters. With your current sequence and abilities, you can provide a very good life for your mother and brother. Don't worry, no one will come to trouble you. But if you insist, I cannot guarantee what will happen." Hearing a hint of sincerity in the other party's words, Zio felt her emotions hard to control and blurted out. "Who exactly are you?" "I am just an ordinary mid-sequence Byander." The golden masked man smiled. "You may not know that the position of Royal Guard Captain has corresponding authority within Military Intelligence Section 9, equivalent to a deputy director responsible for royal family matters. When your father was alive, I was his subordinate and received his help in many aspects. After his passing, I, who had committed no errors and knew no hidden secrets, was excluded from the Power Corps of Military Intelligence Section 9. Hey, you see, I can only be responsible for peripheral intelligence personnel like you." At this point, the golden masked man sighed. "Your father helped me too much, so after I recognized you, I deliberately made you a subordinate intelligence officer, providing you with some help within my authority. However, I have my own family and my own life, so I cannot do overly dangerous things for you or take on too high risks. I originally planned to get you a Judge Byander characteristic formula, then tell you all this and advise you not to accumulate more merits or seek advancement. But I didn't expect you to actually approach that gentleman." Zio was momentarily stunned. Her lips moved slightly for a while before she asked, "My father, what kind of person was he, really?" The golden masked man's tone was filled with a hint of melancholy when he heard this question. He was a truly brave, noble, and just noble, but he wasn't perfect. He was impulsive, impatient, and easily angered. "Thank you." Listening to the other party's description, Zio took a deep breath, finally only uttering this one word. The golden masked man looked at her, understanding that he probably couldn't persuade her, and said helplessly, "Never mind, I will help you get the judge formula. As for the rest, I don't know and don't want to know. But I must warn you, that gentleman's identity is very dangerous. Joining his ranks might be far more dangerous than you imagine." With that, the golden masked man simply waved his hand, signaling Zio that she could leave. As Zio's figure gradually disappeared, a voice suddenly drifted out from the shadows. "Why didn't you ask her about Viscount Stratford?" The golden masked man's body paused slightly. After a brief silence, he replied, "Because it's meaningless." At this point, without waiting for the voice to speak again, he continued, "You should have seen the intelligence on that gentleman. Now that Zio has joined his ranks, it's beyond the scope of what you or I can investigate. Moreover, you should be clearer than I am about His Majesty the King's attitude towards that gentleman. We are all just small figures. In this factional struggle, we only need to do our own thing. Or rather, do you want to get involved at a deeper level?" HMPH. The ethereal voice was clearly somewhat annoyed by his subordinate's impolite words, but he didn't say much more. The current situation was just this chaotic. Military Intelligence Section 9, which had been relatively balanced, had seen changes in various powers after new external factions joined, even without a clear reshuffle. Many now wanted to set traps for that person, but they also feared the power he possessed. Everyone was looking for a suitable opportunity, but clearly, the Golden Masked Man had no intention of becoming the cannon fodder to bring about that opportunity. And he didn't want to either. Chapter 527, Miss Justice was shocked. Ding-a-ling. Outside the carriage window, a bicycle rode past, its crisp bell instantly restoring the slightly unfocused light in Audrey's eyes. She glanced at the bustling street and suddenly let out a small, "Oh." Then, just as she was about to follow her heart's desire and turn towards Viscount Glaint's residence, her heart suddenly trembled slightly. Because she discovered that the protective layer Mr. Devil had given her had suddenly disappeared at some unknown time. Although it hasn't been recharged for several months, I checked it when I woke up this morning, and this protective layer should still last for some time. Thinking of this, Audrey immediately concentrated, immersing her consciousness into her stand, but to avoid being detected, she did not summon her stand, but rather, through the transfer of consciousness, examined her mental state from the stand's perspective. Sure enough, in that state of seemingly looking down upon herself from a higher perspective, the not-so-obvious traces on her psyche became clear, and Audrey then realized that in the short few minutes of travel after leaving home, she must have been influenced by a high-sequence existence, and most likely, it was the missing Herwin Landbus. Although she realized this, she was worried that the other party was still monitoring her and did not immediately try to lift the suggestion, but followed her inner thoughts and said to Annie, "I forgot something, I need to go to Glaint's first." Along the way, although Audrey did not feel that there was anything wrong with her behavior, based on the mental deviation seen from her stand's perspective, she was certain that she had been influenced in some way. This feeling of anxiety persisted until she arrived at the Lowen Charity Scholarship Foundation on Piercefield Street and entered her office. Although asking Susie at this time should yield some results, Audrey was worried that Herwin Landbus had been following her, merely using psychological invisibility to prevent her from seeing him. After much hesitation, she could only pretend to touch up her makeup in front of the dressing mirror, while hinting to herself that she was performing her daily prayers, and silently reciting Mr. Fool's honorific name in ancient Hermes. "The fool that doesn't belong to this era, the protection Mr. Devil gave me suddenly disappeared, I suspect I may have already met Herwin Landbus." She did not show any attitude of hoping for help, but simply described her previous discovery in a calm manner. After a short wait, crimson light suddenly surged, engulfing her like a tide. Suddenly, her thoughts became clear, and a series of images flashed rapidly through her mind. She saw a figure suddenly appear in the carriage she was riding in, and saw that figure dressed in a black three-piece suit, wearing a dark red tie, holding a top hat, with hair already completely white but still feline, and light blue eyes that seemed to hide endless wisdom. It was Herwin Landbus after all. In Audrey's suddenly resurfacing memories, this demigod easily made everyone in the carriage, including Susie, enter a state of stupor, lacking reaction to their surroundings, while he spoke to her in a gentle voice. Two things. First, don't you know Furs and Zio? Arrange to meet them, hypnotize them, and find out what Snow von Paindrax wants them to do. Second, in the upcoming banquets and balls, no longer be so resistant to the overtures of the princes, and praise them a few times in front of Earl Hall and his wife. Remember the above words, this is the mapping of your subconscious. Then, forget that I was here, that I said these words to you, forget that such behavior is abnormal compared to your original demeanor, do not try to seek protection, and deviate from the key position of the Night Church's Grand Mass. Fear, terror, panic and other emotions surged with the recovery of her memory. Audrey stood up, lifted her skirt, and bowed to the great existence seated at the head of the bronze long table. "Thank you for your protection, esteemed Mr. Fool. You handled it well." Klein nodded slightly, but due to his identity, he couldn't help analyze or discuss, so he just smiled and said, "This is a test of destiny for you. I understand." Many thoughts flashed through Audrey's mind at once, about advancing to a demigod, about protecting those she wanted to protect in the complicated situation of Backland. She tried to interpret Mr. Fool's hint, and nodded seriously, saying, I understand. Klein said no more, half sighed, half smiled. Go back, go and meet it. Above the boundless grayish-white fog, crimson lights shot up around the ancient, mottled bronze long table. Snow, who was in Intis participating in choir selections and hymn choices, was still wondering why he was pulled up at such a moment, when he saw Miss Justice bow very sincerely and say, "Everyone, I have something I hope to get your opinions on." Sounds urgent. The hanged man, Alger, nodded slightly and responded. Miss Justice sat down and nodded softly. Yes. She glanced at Snow, then looked at Zio and Furs. I met Herwin Landbus this morning. He hypnotized me to help him do two things and to forget that he had been here. Fortunately, I was quite cautious and careful, and quickly discovered the anomaly. With Mr. Fool's protection, I remembered everything. One of the things Herwin Landbus asked me to do was to arrange a meeting with Miss Judgment and Miss Magician, and take the opportunity to hypnotize them to find out the instructions Mr. Devil gave them. Quote? A string of question marks almost popped up above Snow's head. When did he give instructions to Zio and Furs? Could it be that Stand overstepped its bounds? If that guy really did that, it would mean that it was very likely already contaminated or influenced in some way. Snow's expression became a bit serious. Just as he was about to ask directly, Zio spoke. We haven't received instructions from Mr. Devil. It's just that when we were tracking Viscount Stratford before, we happened to encounter Mr. Devil's subordinate and Stand. After speaking, she added with a bit of guilt. However, yesterday, I did obtain an official identity from Military Intelligence Section 9 with the help of that lady. Snow's eyebrows twitched as he listened, thinking, no wonder Triss wrote such a letter, it wasn't just for help. Speaking of which, this guy really got involved. Snow, who instantly understood Triss's plan, sighed, but then couldn't help but frown, because Herwin Landbus, being from the Russian priest's faction, really had no reason to target him. Was it the Russian priest's instruction? Or his own idea? If it was the latter, how dare he investigate a powerful person who could defeat a divine descent avatar? If it was the former, why would the Russian priest make such a probing attempt that he knew would fail? Is it because he is worried that I will interfere with his predetermined future? Or, using Audrey to test my attitude? Or, is it a warning? A warning made at the cost of a demigod's life. As Snow pondered, Miss Hermit frowned and said, the psychology alchemists, or rather Herwin Landbus, discovered that Mr. Devil, Miss Judgment, and Miss Magician are members of our tarot club. No, it's just because we know each other in reality. Audrey shook her head lightly, then, under Miss Hermit's puzzled gaze, added. They were actually recommended by me to join the club. Mr. Hanged Man and Mr. Devil can testify. Ah. Furs was stunned to hear this, but then suddenly understood everything. Why Mr. Devil appeared in the cemetery where she escaped, why he voluntarily told her and Zio that, the Fool, could help them avoid the influence of the full moon murmurs. As for why it was Mr. Devil and not Miss Audrey, well, those rumors in Lowen now don't seem to be without reason. Seeing Zio and Furs suddenly show expressions of dawning realization, Audrey, who had originally intended to explain, was also slightly surprised. However, the hanged man, Alger, immediately interrupted the digression, chuckling. These things can be discussed later, Miss Justice, the question you want to ask is how to deal with Herwin Landbus. Chapter 528, Ola. Hearing Mr. Hanged Man's words, Justice immediately returned to the main topic and asked seriously, if I not only need to deal with Herwin Landbus, but also make sure the psychology alchemists don't suspect me, what should I do? Although Alger had no experience dealing with demigods, with the mindset he had developed over a long time, he still made some deductions, locate Herwin Landbus's whereabouts, and then make a move after he has interacted with others. How do we locate him? Audrey posed the question herself, then answered it herself. Get the answer from Judgment and Miss Magician, and after seeing Herwin Landbus again, wait for him to leave, then recite Mr. Fool's honorific name and ask him to cast his gaze upon this demigod. Hearing Justice's words, Klein pondered for a moment, then spoke through World. I'll remind you of one thing. Judgment and Miss Magician are probably already being watched by Adam in the real world. The psychology alchemists originated from the excavation of Hermes's ruins. Hermes was a member of the Twilight Hermit Order. One of the founders of the Twilight Hermit Order is Adam, and Mr. Fool does not wish to directly antagonize the Twilight Hermit Order in this matter. Even if we do something, we should try not to be discovered. The Twilight Hermit Order is the ancient secret organization that Emperor Rosal once joined. While the members of the Tarot Club were shocked by Mr. World's information-rich statement, Miss Hermit immediately recalled a question she had asked before, muttering to herself as if seeking confirmation. Mr. World heard this and immediately gave an answer. Yes, so after you return to reality, it's best not to recall these matters, as it's easy to be perceived. If you're not confident in yourselves, you can ask Miss Justice here to give you some psychological hints. Above the gray fog fell into a brief silence, until Snow let out 2 light coughs. Ahem, this matter can be pushed onto me. After all, my public identity can never be linked to the Tarot Club. Isn't Herwin Landbus trying to find out about me? You might as well tell him this. Listening to Snow's words, everyone, including Klein, was somewhat inexplicably shocked, and even began to doubt whether what Snow said was false information or if he really intended to do it. After a brief silence, Hanged Man had a flash of inspiration. His gaze swept over Justice, Magician, and Judgment, then he gave Snow a meaningful look before saying, "Which of you is a believer of the Evernight Goddess?" "I am." Judgment did not hide it, and Audrey also raised her hand slightly. Hanged Man nodded slightly upon seeing this and said, "We can try to create some misdirection, making it seem like the Night Church, not the Tarot Club, is behind the plan to deal with Herwin Landbus." Actually, Alger really wanted to say to misdirect it is the Aurora Order's doing, since the psychology alchemists also seemed to have a grudge against the Aurora Order. But the problem was, everyone in the Beander circle across the continent now knew that the high-ranking members of the Aurora Order were all in Intis. At this point, no one would believe it if they tried to pin the blame on the Aurora Order. With a direction in mind, the Tarot Club's think tank began to refine the plan, including how to interfere with divination, how to attract attention, and so on. Even the distribution of spoils had been discussed. Time, too, quietly passed. Wednesday afternoon, inside Viscount Glaint's mansion. Returning from the stables and making a detour, Audrey, dressed in a simple white ladies shirt, practical dark trousers, and knee-high polished leather boots, with a fitted black jacket-style riding habit, stood in the Viscount's study, looking at Judgment and Furs, and asked, "What did Snow von Paindrax ask you to do?" Her emerald eyes were like ancient pool water in deep mountains, quiet, profound, and clear, making people unconsciously fall into them. Furs and Judgment were indeed hypnotized, but having received a round of hints above the gray fog beforehand, they followed the script and gave the pre-arranged answer. Mr. Paindrax hopes to use traitors from the Demonist sect to lure out high-ranking members of the Demonist sect. What does he want with high-ranking Demonist sect members? I don't know, but I infer it's not for cooperation. Why did he choose you? Because I had some dealings with Mr. Paindrax a long time ago to investigate my father's death, and although my father's former subordinates were ostracized, they still represented a considerable force for him, who had just joined Military Intelligence Section 9. He believed I had enough value. As all the questions in the plan were asked, Audrey said softly, "All right, you will wake up when you hear me clap." As soon as she finished speaking, Audrey gently clapped her hands. Judgment and Furz's eyes instantly cleared, and then the few of them exchanged a few pleasantries. Watching Judgment and Furz bid farewell and leave, Audrey casually picked up a book from the bookshelf, intending to stay for another half an hour until Judgment entered the nearest Evernight Goddess church and completed her prayers, before going elsewhere. This way, no matter when Herwin Landbus appeared, she would be prepared. However, before she could even open the book, Herwin Landbus's voice suddenly rang in her ear, "Well done." Audrey's pupils instantly dilated. She quickly turned her head and saw Herwin Landbus standing by the sconce on the diagonal opposite wall. Although she had previously experienced Mr. Devil invisibly following her, the same thing done by a familiar friend and a clear enemy elicited completely different psychological responses. Mr. Devil had startled her back then, let alone Herwin Landbus, who clearly harbored malice. This completely unexpected situation made Audrey's scalp tingle. She tried hard to keep her mind taut, both relieved that her previous actions were convincing enough and simultaneously suppressing her mental state, trying not to overthink, lest Herwin Landbus read her thoughts. Her eyes were first bewildered, then showed a look of realization, as if she had finally woken up from a long dream. "Mr. Landbus, why are you here? This should be your first true attempt at hypnotizing someone. I was worried something might go wrong, so I specifically came to wait here." "Heh, given your background, you indeed rarely have opportunities to use this ability." Herwin Landbus's voice was gentle and filled with concern, unconsciously melting away the wariness in Audrey's eyes. In Audrey's spiritual world, she once again felt a division of consciousness, partly elevated, looking down at the island and the sea. This made her clearly realize that the feelings of goodwill and security she was experiencing were the result of being guided. Herwin Landbus, seeing Audrey's state recover, nodded lightly and said, "How did they answer you just now?" Audrey candidly repeated the previous questions and answers. During this process, Audrey could clearly see a figure rapidly ascending from the sea of subconsciousness, climbing the materialized stairs, penetrating the subconscious domain, and landing on the island of her mind-body. That figure was identical to Herwin Landbus, but his face held no smile, his demeanor was sinister, parts of his skin were covered in grayish-white scales, and his eyes had not only changed from light blue to golden yellow, but had also become vertical, like some animals. If she hadn't had a similar experience before, Audrey would probably have shown a flaw by now, but even without a flaw, Herwin Landbus continued with his questions. As Audrey perfectly answered each detail, Herwin Landbus seemed to relax. He nodded in satisfaction and said, "Excellent, you truly have a talent for hypnosis. Once these recent matters are concluded, I will give you the Dreamwalker potion and personally preside over your ritual. Don't be too resistant to love and marriage. You're not even 20 yet, it's the time to pursue such things." Audrey, under the spiritual sky, puffed out her cheeks in dissatisfaction, watching this detestable fellow give her hints, yet she had no choice but to control her on the island of consciousness to show a hint of shyness and longing. However, just as she thought everything was about to end, Herwin Landbus suddenly turned his head, narrowed his eyes, and asked several questions in an extremely rapid voice, giving no opportunity to react. Although Audrey kept up with his train of thought, Herwin Landbus's expression grew serious. His light blue eyes became vertical and tinged with gold. He said coldly, "These things all seem like mere coincidences, but to a spectator, too many coincidences together are not so simple." As he spoke, a powerful force washed over Audrey's island of consciousness, and the surrounding waves of the spiritual sea surged with a roar. At the same time, the sinister-looking Herwin Landbus reappeared on the island, remaining in the part beneath the seawater, allowing grayish-white dragon scales to fly into the island's foundation, which was the vast subconscious realm of humanity. Audrey felt her thoughts twist for a moment, wanting to speak out everything, to confess all her secrets. Relying on the clarity of her under the spiritual sky, she barely managed to control herself, but she also knew that in such a high-intensity confrontation, she would definitely not last long. Just then, an exquisite key, hanging on her waist like an ornament, suddenly emitted light. Above Audrey's island of consciousness, a magnificent and imposing black castle abruptly appeared, directly breaking through Herwin Landbus's mental blockade. There really is a problem. Herwin Landbus was knocked out of the island of consciousness by the castle, falling into the sea of subconsciousness, his face growing even colder. But just as he tried to violently affect the spiritual world, a phantom suddenly appeared out of thin air. A fist covered in hideous dragon scales instantly arrived before him. In an instant, a sharp pain erupted from the spiritual body, which should not have felt pain. Herwin Landbus felt his brain instantly go blank, with only a roar left in his ears. Aura. Chapter 529, The Demigod Suppressed by Two Old Ones. Herwin Landbus, who had been directly blasted out of the mind world, hadn't even figured out what he had encountered before a sharp pain flared across his face again. The powerful impact directly penetrated his proud demigod-level dragon scale defense, striking his spiritual world. For a moment, his spiritual island, floating on the vast sea of collective subconsciousness, also vibrated violently. Aura, 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 aura. A strange battle cry, accompanied by fists that made no sound, rained down on Herwin Landbus. Audrey, seizing the opportunity, tightly gripped her wallet. In that instant, something within the wallet shattered. Cherry-colored light enveloped Audrey's body. As the Aria fashion unfolded, a cherry-colored barrier firmly encased Audrey. Disregarding the plan they had set earlier, Audrey waved her small wand, converting spirituality into flames to ignite the feather on her soft hat. At the same time, she silently chanted Mr. Fool's honorific name, while her stand, dressed in hunting attire, continued to furiously attack Herwin Landbus. However, after a brief moment of shock, Herwin Landbus had already reacted. Although he didn't understand how this strange spirit body was directly attacking his spiritual world, as a spectator pathway demigod, he had plenty of ways to resist such attacks. As a grotesque-faced figure emerged on his spiritual island, the island's vibrations immediately subsided. In its place, the figure's body was covered in countless fist marks. As this virtual personality, which had borne the brunt of the attack, was almost shattered, Herwin Landbus's eyes once again turned into golden vertical pupils. A powerful deterrent burst forth, sweeping up a spiritual storm that blew away the brilliant diamond. At the same time, he suddenly opened his mouth, and a colorless, transparent force spewed out. It was the Mind Dragon's dragon breath. Herwin Landbus's reaction was so swift that Audrey had only just finished the second line of Mr. Fool's honorific name when she was hit by the terrifying spiritual dragon breath. The attack, which seemed capable of piercing spirit bodies and tearing apart minds, almost made Audrey lose her ability to think. But in the very next moment, as countless cherry blossoms scattered, the pain seemed to vanish as if it had never existed. King of Yellow and Black, who controls good luck. Without time to ponder what had happened, Audrey quickly finished chanting Mr. Fool's honorific name and tried to set up another layer of protection. It was only then that she noticed the wand in her hand had disappeared, and her clothes had returned to their previous state. Audrey then realized that she had died once just now. Audrey's limbs turned cold for a moment, but Herwin Landbus launched another attack. The spiritual storm affected both the real and spiritual worlds, and Audrey's spiritual island felt like it was facing a typhoon. Feeling the pain on the spiritual level, Audrey instead calmed down. She suddenly realized that Herwin Landbus was probably more inclined to control her than to kill her. The exquisite key flashed again, and the phantom of a black door blocked Herwin Landbus's dragon might. However, Audrey did not use this opportunity to escape or counterattack. Instead, she adjusted her mental state and feigned fear. As a noble young lady who had never truly experienced battle, even with her powerful abilities, it was reasonable for her to show fear after enduring pain, wasn't it? Herwin Landbus did not easily believe the emotions Audrey displayed, but his pride as a demigod made him seize the opportunity to launch battle hypnosis. He was confident that no matter how many mystical items this young girl possessed, it would only delay her defeat. After all, he was a demigod, and she was only a sequence 6. However, this time, Herwin Landbus was surprised to find that his battle hypnosis penetrated the defenses of the spiritual island without any obstruction. Just as the opponent's mind-body was within reach, that strange spirit body appeared again. At this moment, the hunting attire on this spirit body was completely covered in scales, making it look more like a spectator pathway demigod than Herwin Landbus. But after their previous clash, Herwin Landbus had seen through the spirit body's true nature. His eyes suddenly glowed golden, and immense pressure became almost tangible. Only this time, Herwin Landbus was unable to blow away the stand. More accurately, just before he activated his ability, a massive force directly tore apart the defenses of his spiritual island. Immediately afterward, his mind-body felt as if it had been pierced by a powerful force, and his eyes rolled back, nearly losing consciousness. When he forcefully stabilized his mind, he was startled to discover that the Viscount Glaint's study had, at some unknown point, transformed into a black ancient castle. A blood-red full moon hung high in the sky. Audrey had already stood on the third-floor viewing platform of the ancient castle, and in front of him were two young men. One was wearing an Intis-style suit with an open front and a sneering smile at the corner of his mouth. The other was wearing a black trench coat, a semi-tall silk top hat, and a pair of glasses on his face, exuding a cold aura. Snow von Paindrax and Gehrman Sparrow. Realizing he had fallen into a trap, Herwin Landbus unhesitatingly entered his mythical creature form. But just as his body began to transform, he stiffened. Unbeknownst to him, black shadows had already filled the space around him, and one by one, cold, bloodthirsty, cruel, or insane gazes completely locked onto him. Although Klein was cooperating with Snow for the first time, Facing such an almost spoon-fed assist, he raised his azure rose without hesitation. With a series of gunshots, and with the help of spirit-controlling bullets, Herwin Landbus, this demigod, was transformed into his marionette with almost no room to struggle. The entire process was unimaginably easy, making Klein even suspect that this was a fake demigod. Mr. Devil, Mr. World. Audrey, seeing that the battle had ended, immediately jumped down from the viewing platform. However, as if realizing something, she puffed out her cheeks and said, "You were here all along. This was Mr. Devil's idea." Klein, in front of his psychiatrist and the acquaintance who had long since exposed his alias, no longer pretended to be cold and easily sold out Snow. Snow, seeing this, spread his hands righteously and said, "Since I already knew he would appear, of course, I wouldn't wait for you to call for help. But instead of jumping out immediately, I thought it was important for you to experience a real battle. As for the result, you did quite well." Upon hearing this, Audrey wanted to explain that her fear at the end was not genuine but a way to induce the opponent to attack her, and then use the fortune stealer charm. However, before she could speak, she noticed a distortion in her surroundings. Once everything settled, she was back in Viscount Glaint's study, and in front of her was Mr. Devil, bending down to pick up the fragments of open black lens bracket fashion area close black lens bracket from the floor. "Where is Mr. World?" Audrey didn't find any trace of Mr. World and was a little worried for a moment. Snow, hearing this, gave a mischievous smile. "That's a secret." Chapter 530, Klein's Complex Mood. After sacrificing the rotten meteor to the mother, Klein looked at the formula made of ash and dirt on the ground with a complicated mood, feeling somewhat confused. Although he had known about the Scholar of Yours ritual from Senior Paindrax, when everything came to fruition, that subtle feeling still gave him a strong sense of being manipulated. For example, the fool that doesn't belong to this era, or the wanderers who had been above the gray fog for an unknown number of years, he suddenly began to worry about the true price of this gift. Correspondingly, there was also the origin of the rotten meteor. The cosmos. Klein suddenly remembered that Senior Paindrax had once said that advancing to Wanderer carried immense danger, to the point where it needed to be censored even in a diary. That was the only time he had seen Senior Paindrax censor something in his diary. Adding to that, during the trial in Paindrax's ancient castle, there was also a censored part in Senior Paindrax's message regarding the moon and the mother cards, and then there was the recent matter of Rosal's corruption. "No, I can't think about this anymore." Klein quickly stopped his thoughts, because Miss Ariana had just reminded him that the more he knew, the easier it was to be infected. He needed to become an angel at least to truly investigate the answers. The huge red moon and the pitch-black night sky faded and disappeared inch by inch. Only then did Klein realize that Mr. Devil's ancient castle had actually been directly embedded within the secret space created by Miss Ariana. To be able to forcibly intervene in a domain created by an angel, that castle is not simple. Klein exclaimed, but found himself back in Viscount Glaint's study. At this moment, Snow seemed to be reviewing the problems from the previous battle with Audrey. "You're back. What's the result?" Snow waved his hand familiarly. Klein took out Herwin Landbus's Beander characteristic and threw it to Snow. "As agreed, the Beander characteristic is yours, the formula and mystical item are mine." There's a spiritual imprint in this Beander characteristic. Don't use it before it's removed. You know I'm not talking about that. Snow took out a tin box from his in my arms and put the Beander characteristic inside. Then he pointed, and 3 pig-headed men picked up illusory bricks and started building a wall in the Viscount's study. "Did you get any important intelligence?" "Don't worry, as long as you don't say that name now, there won't be any problems." "What is this, the 3 little pigs?" Klein held back the twitching of his mouth, his tone slightly subtle as he said. Psychology alchemists originally intended to use the process of Miss Justice and the princess showing affection for each other to divide the 3 great churches. But your appearance introduced more variables. After all, with the persistence shown by your clone, he was worried that internal rifts would appear before the 3 great churches could be divided. Then why would Herwin Landbus, a demigod, personally come to find me? Audrey quickly changed the subject when she heard Mr. World's words, even thinking that cold Mr. World is better. Klein immediately understood Miss Justice's meaning and smiled, saying, To hide from Roll Hall's guards and hypnotize a hypnotist without causing extra commotion, a Sequence 5 might not be able to do it. So, having a demigod personally appear is the most appropriate. And you know Herwin Landbus. In his self-perception, he has already given you enough hints and inducements. He believes that your guard would be lowest if he appeared. At this point, Klein couldn't help but recall Mr. Devil pulling him aside to watch the show while Herwin Landbus tried to hypnotize Miss Justice. He silently offered a stick of incense to Herwin Landbus, but still reminded her. Frankly speaking, if you weren't cautious enough, the whole thing would have proceeded smoothly without anyone noticing, until next Monday. Audrey heard Mr. World's evaluation, her emotions slightly complex as she half smiled and half sighed. So I'm already that powerful. So powerful that it takes a demigod to have a high chance of dealing with her. More powerful than we imagined. Actually, if we hadn't interrupted just now, you might have created a miracle of a Sequence 6 hypnotist hypnotizing a Sequence 4 of the same pathway. Snow spread his hands with a smile. I think you should be preparing to raise money now to buy the Sequence 5 Beander characteristic. Maybe even Sequence 4. Can you also sell me the hypnotist Beander characteristic? Audrey asked a little shyly. It was no secret in the Tarot Club that Mr. Devil could separate Beander characteristics. She also wanted to prepare a promotion potion for Susie. Snow nodded in agreement upon hearing this. Watching the two complete a transaction worth tens of thousands of pounds in an instant, Klein suddenly felt a pang of heartache. Actually, I could have come today. But on second thought, if Mr. Devil's ancient castle hadn't impacted Herwin Landbus's spiritual world and restricted his demigod-like creature form, it wouldn't have been so easy for him to turn him into a marionette. Mr. Devil is really strong. After completing the transaction, Audrey wanted to ask for Zio about the king's secret, but Snow interrupted her with a gesture. Let's discuss these matters above the gray fog. I'm worried that some kind of stress measure has been applied to it. Although it can be shielded for a while, discussing it in reality might cause a mark to appear on you. Klein, who was about to speak, immediately closed his mouth. Having deeply experienced the power of a spectator, he strongly agreed with Mr. Devil's point of view. When it comes to Amon's brother, no amount of caution is too much. However, just then, Klein suddenly saw Mr. Devil's posture change. His original Intis-style suit turned into a classic black three-piece suit, his face grew older, and his eyes turned a light blue color. He had actually become Herwin Landbus. This is. Klein almost thought he had fallen for an illusion and nearly pulled out his gun to shoot, because this Herwin Landbus, from his spirit to his aura, was identical to the previous one. Don't be nervous. After all, Herwin Landbus disappearing here would cause trouble for Viscount Glaint. So I borrowed this Beander characteristic to simulate his aura and fate trajectory. Klein wanted to say that Miss Ariana had already taken responsibility, but considering that his identity as a Nighthawk worshipper couldn't be explicitly stated, and it was indeed not good to let Viscount Glaint take the blame, he nodded. Is there anything I can help with? This clone of mine can't be used anymore, and my main body won't be back in Backland for 2 days. You can pretend to be me and show up for these 2 days, right? It should be fine. Klein considered the range of his current marionette's activities and nodded in agreement. Snow immediately took out a piece of paper and scribbled on it. This is my schedule. You can cancel banquets and salons, but remember to write dance invitations to Miss Justice every day. Also, if Duchess Georgina of Military Intelligence Section 9 looks for me, remember to make an excuse to put her off. And, the dance invitations aren't necessary, are they? Audrey asked weakly, raising her hand, but Snow shook his head and said. I've been writing them all this time. If I suddenly stop, it's easy to link it to Herwin Landbus's actions, and nobles who don't know the inside story will receive the wrong signal. Anyway, it's just for these 2 days. Once my main body returns, it'll be fine if you attend one dance. With that, Snow, who had transformed into Herwin Landbus, disappeared from the room along with the pig-headed men who were building the wall, leaving Klein holding the schedule in a daze, and Audrey with a slightly complex expression. Suddenly, Audrey seemed to have thought of something, her eyes flashing with inspiration, and she immediately said. Mr. World, when you write the invitations, could you write some for other nobles as well? I can help you confirm the list. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks. And those who want to support me, I have a headphone Patreon. Right finger patreon.com/fanficaudiobook. 7 days free trial.